Welcome to the Sherdog Radio Network preview for UFC Fight Night Gane versus Tuivasa, also known as UFC Paris. I'm your host, Ben Duffy of Sherdog.com. Do not adjust your monitors, phones, or television sets. I am not being joined this evening by Keith Schillen, but by Noah Gagnon, new member of the team here at Sherdog, stepping in for Keith, who is indisposed this week. Noah, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here. It's my first one of these podcasts, and I'm excited to talk about these fights.
I'm excited to talk about these fights as well. There is a good amount of meat for, especially further up the card here. But I want to talk about the card in general a little bit before we start diving into each individual fight. This is going to be a historic card. It's the UFC's first foray into France. MMA was only even legalized in France within the last couple of years. I remember, for the longest time, there was no legal MMA in France. I remember kind of weird dust ups happening with regional underground French events that when there was a problem with the result, like there was a complaint that, there was no commission there to handle it. Everything has kind of come together in the last couple of years. The UFC has finally seen fit to go over there, and they've done their best to make this an auspicious debut in a new and very populous country that's going crazy for MMA. It did have to be a fight night simply because the UFC sticks to its philosophy that every pay-per-view has to have either a title fight or a Diaz Chimaev type big time spectacle fight. So the best they could do is former, interim champ / title challenger Ciryl Gane against Tai Tuivasa. But I guess one sign of success would be what a good job they've done stocking it with local talent, local as in French. This is a 12-fight card, so 24 fighters. I see 5 French fighters and one Quebecois that maybe they're trying to sneak in under the radar there, or just hoping they'll root for Charles Jourdain because he speaks French. And then a bunch of European, like especially continental Europe fighters, bunch of Germans, Poles, a Swiss fighter. This has got to be some sort of record. And Sherdog associate editor Jay Petrie, my good friend, is kind of our stats and trivia man. I told him when I was starting to research this card, dude, this card's only got 2 Americans on it. That's got to be some sort of UFC record, or at least the first time since blank that there have been this few Americans on a UFC card. So I'm sure he's looking into that right now. Maybe by the time we're having the recap for this, we'll have some sort of definite knowledge. But okay, the first question I want to ask you, Noah, Keith and I, when we recap these cards, we always give it a letter grade based on how good the card was. Was this an A+ card, a card of the year candidate, an all-timer? Was it a C+, just another card? Was it an F? Was it a disaster? We've also started doing that in advance based on how they look on paper. Like, on a kind of A through F scale, like how excited are you to see this card based on who's on it? Where would you rate your interest level in this card, understanding that we're going to grade these on a scale based on whether they're a pay-per-view or a fight night card? Like if they were asking you to pay $75 for this card, you'd obviously hold it to a higher standard. But considering that this is a free cable card, if you didn't have to watch this for work, like what would be your level of interest for it? How likely would you be to tune in from start to finish? Like give it a letter grade just based on expectation.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if we've seen so many times with these cards, your anticipation certainly doesn't equal what's going to happen when the fights actually start going. But if I had to give it a grade for a free fight night, it's going into a new market for the first time. Like you said, they have a lot of local guys matched up against foreign talent, which I'm always a big fan of at all levels of MMA, even on smaller regional scenes. I love when they're, pitching up a neighborhood guy against an outsider. It's a new market for the UFC, so I'm excited to see how the fans react. I know the French people, not stereotype, but not typically known to be the rowdiest bunch, but at the end of the day, it's a cage fight coming to their city for the first time. So we saw that. I know it wasn't their first time in Salt Lake, but Salt Lake's not a typical market for the UFC, and we saw that crowd was jumping the whole time, as compared to a lot of times, when they're doing these cards in Vegas or familiar markets, it can be a little more dead. So I do expect the building to be rocking in there. And then in terms of the fights themselves, main and co-main are, I would say, as good as it gets for a free card. I mean, Robert Whittaker versus Marvin Vettori, that could easily be a 5-round fight. The main event sells itself. There is some weird bout order stuff with the DiChirico fight kind of right before those two going on. So because of there's definitely a drop off in fights after the main and co-main. So just because of that, I'd probably go B+. But when we're talking main, co-main, new city, I think that really bodes well for this card, and has me looking forward to it a lot.
I'm with you on pretty much all of that. I'd give it probably just a solid B. Like down card, there's a lot of debuting fighters, like 24 fighters on this card. 7 of them are making their UFC debut. And oftentimes, especially with a fight night card, that's not a healthy sign. It means that there was a late cancellation due to COVID or injury or whatever, and they just had to grab whoever they could. That's the case with a few of the fighters here, to be perfectly honest. In the case of some others, there are some hotly anticipated debuts. Like Michal Figlak is making his UFC debut here. My only suspense about him was whether he was going to be in a Cage Warriors title eliminator and his next fighter was going to get snapped up by the UFC. Turns out he's snapped up by the UFC. So there's a bunch of good stuff on this card. Top to bottom, it's not the most stacked with divisional relevance or talent, but there's a bunch of fights that should be interesting. We're going to get some violence. You made a good point. You mentioned UFC Salt Lake that, was just the other weekend. I lived in Salt Lake City for 15 years. I spent almost as much time there, or about as much time as I have here in Houston. It made me happy to see it get a card and to be such a live crowd. But that's sort of been the rule since the UFC has gone back to doing fight nights away from the Apex. Almost all of those have been just dynamite. Both London cards, UFC Columbus, just about all of them. Like, I think UFC Austin was the only kind of somewhat dud in that bunch, but UFC Paris is going to have a lot to live up to. I have the feeling it's gonna live up to it. France has been waiting for this for a long time. Any other general thoughts or comments on this one before we dig into these prelims?
No, just like I said, definitely some strange bout order stuff, like the Nassourdine Imavov fight. I think that should be the one right before that Whittaker one on the main card. The Ailin Perez fight. I'm excited for her debut, but it's pretty high up on the card, I think. So that kind of. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I agree, but this is probably all going to get jumbled by the time these things actually hit the cage. We're recording this on Sunday night of beginning of fight week. I have the feeling that outside of the top 3 fights, anything on this card is fair game to get jumbled somewhere else. And for all we know, even maybe the Alessio de Chirico versus Roman Kopylov fight isn't secure in that feature fight slot. But I agree that as of right now, it is a little odd in some spots.
Yeah, it's definitely a little odd. So I'm hopefully they straighten some of that stuff out.
First up at UFC Paris is a men's featherweight matchup between 2 debuting fighters in William Gomis and Jarno Errens. This fight was just added to this card within maybe 8 or 10 days of fight night. The UFC decided it wanted one more fight, wanted one more Frenchman. It gets both, and it gets 2, frankly, kind of intriguing prospects, even if they weren't on the radar in the sense of being like right on the door of getting a call from the UFC. They're guys who've been on the radar. Let's introduce him. William Gomis, 25-year-old from Paris, is 10-2 overall. This will be his debut. He is coming in off of his last 5 fights have been in 5 different promotions. That's the life of a European prospect these days. He fought most recently in Aries Fighting Championship in Italy, where he beat Jose Lima Santiago by 3rd-round punches. But yeah, he's on a 8-fight winning streak. He's an MMA factory product, so someone who trains along Ciryl Gane, your headliner tonight. And he is taking on Errens. Errens, the 20 7-year-old Dutchman is 13-3-1 overall. This again will be his debut as well. He most recently fought back in August in Brave CF, where he took a unanimous decision over Alisher Abdullayev. Odds pretty wide on this one. Gomis is minus 210, Errens plus 180 on the comeback. Both of these guys, in terms of their physical tools and their raw skills, look like people who could have some staying power in the UFC, even in the ultra deep, ultra competitive men's featherweight division. But to be honest, they both have a lot of raw prospect feel to them for guys who have as many fights as they do. Like Gomis he's 10-2, so a dozen fights, age 25. There's something about him that feels to me like almost like I'm watching a 4-0 phenom or something. And a bit of the same goes for Errens. Gomis physically is a huge 145er. Both of them are big. Gomis is huge. He's listed at 6 feet tall. I'll be interested to see him when he's toe to toe with Errens. But you look at him and he's kind of got that John Jones body where he looks impossibly big for his weight class because he's got long, skinny legs, and it allows him to just have a bigger, broader torso with more muscle on it than you would expect for that weight class. He's a southpaw, again, tall and long. Uses it pretty well. He has fast hands and he has fast kicks that he will just kind of flick out, and he's not throwing them 100%. He's just, throwing them maybe 80%, getting them out there really fast and kind of surprising his opponents and keeping them at range with those kicks. Errens, also, he's again listed at 5'11". I'll be interested to see, how they line up against each other. But, you say 5'11", that makes me think of, someone like Max Holloway, and he has kind of a Max Holloway build. He looks like a taller, thinner guy. He is a wild man on the feet. He stands orthodox. He throws a lot of spinning stuff. You're going to get spinning hook kicks from him, spinning back fists, spinning back elbows. Both of these guys they're pretty adept on the ground, but neither of them really wants it to go there. They seem to both end up on the ground just because they end up in collisions. They end up in scrambles. So this is a fight between two people that are probably envisioning a highlight reel knockout of the other, but I would not be surprised if this thing ends up on the ground. Both of them are just kind of impatient fighters and more hittable, more vulnerable to their opponent's offense than they need to be, especially in the case of Gomis. Gomis's last couple of fights, he's come out like a house on fire and just kind of thrown the whole kitchen sink at his opponent in the first 90 seconds of the fight. Just almost desperate to get a highlight reel knockout or some kind of like fast and sassy submission and really impress. Where if he took a more measured approach, he's so much better than most of these guys he's fighting that he could get the win and just undergo a lot less risk. And it's been fine for him on the local scene, but if he's going to stick around at the UFC level, the average run-of-the-mill UFC featherweight is going to chew him up if he doesn't change his approach. His two losses, when this fight was announced, I was like, why is this Gomis's guy, why is his name familiar? Because I don't really remember any of his fights or doing tape study on him, but his name was instantly familiar. It's because he fought two fellow prospects, Saladin Parnasse and Morgan Charrier, two of the best prospects in Central Europe, when they were all like 18 or 19 years old at the beginning of their careers. He lost both of those fights, but like I said, he's 8-0 since then. I do slightly favor Gomis in this one. I think he's physically bigger. I think he's physically a little faster and stronger than Errens. And if Errens were not as wild as he is, if Errens were, a little more defensively sound, if he were willing to try and bring this to the ground rather than just shrug and be okay if it gets there, I might feel like picking him for the upset, but I don't trust Errens to fight to his best advantage either. So I expect these guys to just go spinning at each other like a couple of Beyblades and just, kind of clash and knock each other around in the center of the octagon for a bit. Like I said, even though they both are going to want the knockout, I think it's going to end up on the ground, and they're both pretty adept grapplers, but give me Gomis to get the better of things on the ground and for things to be more or less even on the feet, and for Gomis to win at least 2 out of 3 rounds. So give me Gomis by decision in this one. But again, these are two guys that they have staying power in the UFC, and even if they don't right now, like if one or both of them washes out, they're young enough that they could be back in a few years. Any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I'm definitely excited for it. I mean, you talked about two guys making their debut. I'm always a fan of that when they do those kinds of matchups. Kind of has that Dana White Contender Series feel, not in terms of the stakes, but in terms of the style of fight, where both guys are definitely a little more raw, a little more reckless. And these are two guys who are, risk takers and reckless to begin with in their fight style. So matching them up, I think we're going to see them come out hard and fast in these first couple rounds. We could be looking at some knockdowns early in this fight from either guy. I think, like you said, Gomis has the physical tools and his advantage that I think as the fight goes on might definitely start to wear. Like to wear him down. So I do give him the edge just because of the physical tools. But I think if Jarno can come out early and catch him, then that's his best chance to come out hard. But like you said, Gomis is a guy that's known for coming out hard early himself too. So I think we're definitely looking at some fireworks in the first round. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a finish in the first round, and then if it does get to those later rounds, it could start to get ugly from there.
Gun to your head, which do you say happens? Are we going all the way, or do you think we get the finish in the first round?
Gun to your head, I think Gomis, since he does come out so hard and he's fighting a guy that's known to be a little reckless, I think he's going to be able to get him out of there in the first round. Gun to head, I'd say.
Outstanding. So we have 2 picks for William Gomis to have a successful debut on short notice at UFC Paris. Next up at UFC Fight Night 209 is a women's featherweight matchup between the debuting Ailin Perez and Stephanie Egger, who steps up on short notice and steps up in weight to meet the debuting fighter. Egger, the 34-year-old from Switzerland, is 7-3 overall. She is 2-2 since joining the UFC. She lost her last time out. It was back on August 6th at UFC on ESPN, Santos versus Hill, where she got tapped out in the first round by Mayra Bueno Silva. That put the brakes on a 2-fight win streak for her over Jessica Rose Clark and Shanna Young. She will be taking on Perez. Perez had been scheduled to face Zara Ferran Santos in this featherweight matchup. That obviously would have been one more French fighter on the card. Zara Ferran withdrew about a week ago. Egger steps back, clearly wants to get it back as quickly as possible after that demoralizing loss, and steps up in weight. So hopefully that makes it a little less of a concern that she fought so recently. Let's meet Perez. 27-year-old Argentinian is 7-1 overall. She is on a 2-fight win streak, both of them in the Samurai Fight House promotion. Hammered Stephanie Braguirac into a doctor stoppage between rounds back in May in the headliner of Samurai Fight House 4. Perez has typically fought at 135 on the regional scene in South America, so this was going to be a step up in weight for her as well. I will freely admit, a lot of times when a new prospect signs with the UFC and is about to debut, I already know about them. Like, they've been on my radar for a couple of years. I've seen a bunch of their fights, so tape study is pretty easy. Ailin Perez, I had to start from ground zero, but tape study ended up being pretty easy. I watched 3 of Perez's last 5 fights. In all 3 of them, she secured a body lock takedown of some kind within the first minute of the fight. Either, double underhooks, just a straight body lock and trip. She got one that was almost like a, lateral drop. But yeah, just got a body lock takedown within the first 60 seconds of the fight, immediately moved to a dominant position, just either, side control, full mount, got a crucifix in one of them, and then proceeded to beat the living bejesus out of her opponent. She has a known game plan. It's pretty interesting because she presents as a kickboxer. She sets up like somebody who wants to kickbox, sets up an orthodox, will like flick out, some teep kicks or even a side kick, will paw with her jab, but it is all a ruse to close the distance because all she wants to do is hug you, pick you up, and smash you onto the ground, and then like sit on your chest and beat you up. It's a pretty straightforward game plan, and if that works on Stephanie Egger, I will eat this hat on the recap show. Ailin Perez, I mean, she has some upside in the UFC, especially if she's willing to fight at 145, because at 145, almost anybody who wants to at 135 could step up to 145, win one fight, and get a title shot against Amanda Nunes in their next fight. Like there's literally nothing there. So Perez, she's 2 fights away from a title shot now, but this is a rough style matchup for a debut for someone who wants to do that in Stephanie Egger. Stephanie Egger is a decorated judoka. While she's stepping up to 145 as well, she's going to be physically much bigger than Ailin Perez. Perez is a fire plug. She's about 5'5", built like a tank, thick legs, thick hips. Egger is tall, a little broader, muscular, has that kind of freaky core strength and balance of a lifelong judoka. And if Perez just wants to run up and kind of try to grab Stephanie Egger and pick her up and slam her, I think Perez is going to end up on the bottom, and she's going to end up on the bottom and getting Kimura or armbarred really fast. So Perez probably has some ceiling in the UFC, but the odds are what they are for a reason. And I should have mentioned those off the top. Egger right now is like minus 350 on most outlets. Perez around plus 275 as the substantial underdog. I understand why. This is a terrible matchup for her, but if she wants to take her lumps here and come back there, she'll get at least 2 more opportunities, and maybe even an opportunity to drop down to bantamweight if she wants to try that. But for now, give me Stephanie Egger by first round submission. If Perez wants to try to strike with her, Egger is not an incompetent striker, and she's going to be much taller and much longer. And Perez just isn't that technical on the feet, so she could draw things out if she wants to try to engage in a kickboxing match. But I think she's going to try to do the Ailin Perez thing, and it's just not going to work well against Stephanie Egger. So give me Egger by first round submission here.
Yeah, Perez was supposed to fight, like you mentioned, Zara Farron going into this. And this is one of those rare instances where the replacement fight actually appears to be way tougher than the originally scheduled bout. So if you're Perez and they call you saying Farron's out, now you have Egger, you're probably pulling your hair out.
I just, sorry to cut you off, but let me throw one thing in here. Ailin Perez was originally being brought in so that Zara Farron dos Santos would have a winnable fight in front of the French fans. And Zara Farron dos Santos, if we're being honest, is not a good fighter. So make of that what you will. But yeah, please continue.
Yeah, you mentioned Zara Farron. I mean, she's 38 years old, 0-2 in the UFC. All power to her, but not exactly someone the UFC would normally be trying to bolster their stock. So if you're being in to get a win for her, that kind of tells where you're at. She does have a good record on paper, but at the end of the day, she is a prospect coming out of
Argentina.
Her promotion. Samurai Fight House was the promotion. So not too many hot prospects coming out of there. To her credit, she has the girls she's fought there, she smashes them. But Stephanie Egger's a different beast. So, yeah, I agree. I think that if she does just try to punch her way in, Stephanie Egger's going to have her way with her. And I agree with that first round submission call for sure. And even if Perez is able to get a takedown, she's still in deep waters with an opponent like Egger. So, yeah, I agree. Give me the first round submission there. And Perez, though, I do think with her physical skill set, could have a promising career in the UFC. Like you mentioned, 145, you're always there. They're always looking for talent in that division. She is big. So I wouldn't completely write it.
They're hoping for talent. They'll settle for bodies.
Yeah. Right. They're especially with her physical skill set. So even if she shows flash, I think they'll be excited about her. But I don't think it's going to be her night. That being said, I wouldn't write her off as someone who's just going to flame out in her first 3 fights. I think she has potential, but not against someone like Egger.
Next up at UFC Paris, we have a middleweight matchup between Abusupiyan Magomedov and Dustin Stoltzfus. Magomedov, the 31-year-old Russian fighting out of Germany, is 24-4-1 overall. This will be his UFC debut. He was signed by the UFC over a year ago, and this will be the UFC's 3rd try at getting him a debut fight, and this will be a replacement opponent for that 3rd fight, assuming it makes it to the cage. He's had sort of the hat trick of failed debuts. He withdrew from one with an injury, from one with visa issues, and then one of his opponents withdrew from the other one. He was supposed to face Mahmoud Muradov here. Muradov is the one that dropped out, and in steps Dustin Stoltzfus. Stoltzfus, the 30-year-old American who I believe he now trains out of the US, but he originally kind of trained and broke through out of Germany as well. So kind of an interesting parallel between those two. But 30 years old, 14-4 overall. He is just 1-3 since joining the UFC as a graduate of the 4th season of Dana White's Contender Series. He's just 1-3 in the UFC, but that one win was in his last appearance. That was a unanimous decision win over Dwight Grant at UFC on ABC Ortega versus Rodriguez back in July. Prior to that, he had lost his first 3 straight against Kyle Dawkins, Rodolfo Vieira, and Gerald Meerschaert. He'll try to make it 2 in a row against the debuting Magomedov. He is not favored to do so. Magomedov is minus 250, Stoltzfus plus 215 as the underdog. Man, the UFC is such fast moving waters these days. 42, 43 cards a year, 12, pay-per-views, that it doesn't take long for me to forget about a fighter. I keep forgetting about Abus Magomedov because the very first season of PFL, like their first season of the season and playoffs format, he made it to the final. He got sparked by Lewis Taylor in the final, even though Magomedov had been the odds-on favorite to win the title and to win the $1 million that season. But I was really excited for him as I would say a prospect. I mean, he was 28 years old at the end of that 2018 season. I was like, UFC needs to sign this guy now. The middleweight division needs him. And I saw him as probably at least a future top 10 fighter and likely a title contender at some point. And since then, just he lost to Taylor in the finals. He went back and fought in Europe, got a couple of, easy wins. Everything was kind of derailed by COVID. The UFC finally did sign him, but, it's taken a full year to get him his debut. He's now 31 years old and has had a couple of injuries, and he just kind of fell off my radar. But in 2018, Abus Magomedov was dope. You see the guy, you see the foreguard, you hear the Magomedov last name, you're like, is this another Dagestani grinder? This guy was not a grinder. He was a monster. Just a big guy for the weight class, like not Titanic, but like a big-bodied middleweight who had power in both hands, really aggressive, huge body kicks. Trying to remember which guy it was, Anderson Gonçalves, where he started the ball rolling by folding the guy with a body kick that was so nasty that Gonçalves just kind of melted, and Magomedov looks up at the ref. Do I have to go down there and punch the guy? And the ref was like, yes. And he went down and punched him. But in the playoffs, Sadabu C, who's, all of a sudden maybe about to be a PFL millionaire, Magomedov was slamming him all over the place, like, some suplexes and throws. He has all the offensive weapons. He had all the offensive weapons and had the gas tank to go 3 rounds, even though most of his fights have been first round finishes. I was super excited for this guy to join the UFC, and I still am. I'm just wondering what's left. Is he still the guy he was? Because if he's still the guy he was at the end of 2018, where, yeah, he got knocked out by Lewis Taylor in 30 seconds, but Lewis Taylor was a man of destiny that year. I thought that if they rematched a month after that fight, that Magomedov would have mopped the floor with Taylor. Like, if Magomedov is still the guy he was at the end of 2018, it's not a long line to a title shot in the UFC middleweight division. There is a reason that the number 2 and number 3 middleweights in the UFC are fighting in the co-main event of this card, and almost nobody gives a shit because neither of these guys is getting another fight with Israel Adesanya in this century. There's a reason Israel Adesanya is fighting an old kickboxing nemesis later this year. The UFC is desperate for a new face. The UFC 185-pound division, like the kind of 1 through 15, it's full of guys that are aging. A lot of them are pushing towards 40, Jared Cannonier, Derek Brunson, they're pushing 40. Most of these guys have already fought each other, sometimes multiple times. At 31, if Magomedov still has his tools, he could have a really quick track to a title shot here, especially because there'd be no reason to slow roll him. He's an exciting fighter. It's not like a Leon Edwards or a Merab Dvalishvili, where, not all the fights are exciting. This guy's fights are all exciting, but it all starts with a fight against Stoltzfus. And I think this is a perfect test it's a perfect test for Magomedov, because Dustin Stoltzfus, he's 1-3 in the UFC, but he has been matched up against such a brutal slate of opposition that I wonder who he pissed off. Like, did he get into the UFC through blackmail? Like, he came out, came to the UFC with a decent but not super distinguished regional record. He fought in some of the second tier European promotions. He won on the Contender Series, but it was a first round thing where his opponent got injured. We don't really know how that fight would have gone. And then he comes in unheralded and gets in a row Kyle Dawkins, who was a top 15 guy at the time, Rodolfo Vieira, he's Rodolfo Vieira, just one of the greatest grapplers ever to cross over to MMA, and really pissed off at that point in his career. And what's his bounce back from those two? Gerald Meerschaert, who's a top 15, if not top 10 guy now. In his fourth fight against Dwight Grant, even Grant is not an easy out. Just the UFC has pitched Dustin Stoltzfus really, really hard. And this is another brutal matchup for Stoltzfus. But he's a good test for Muradov, because Stoltzfus is good everywhere. He can fight out of both stances. He has good kicks. Not a ton of power, but he throws enough volume that his opponent has to do something. Like, if you want to stand and win rounds against Dustin Stoltzfus, you're either going to have to hurt him, you're going to have to take him down, or you're going to have to throw enough volume to keep up with him. That's a good test. And Stoltzfus himself is an underratedly good wrestler. Like, good offensive wrestler, pretty good defensive wrestler. It's tough when you're taking on someone like Rodolfo Vieira, who, especially for like a Brazilian BJJ guy, shoots double legs, that are like a cannonball. So if Magomedov is still the real deal, he should roll over Stoltzfus, and that should be an underratedly difficult achievement, because Stoltzfus is underratedly good. And if he's not the real deal anymore, if he's fallen off any because of injury, because of illness, because of time on the shelf, because of COVID, where he barely fought at all for that first year, Stoltzfus is the guy that will let us know. I am almost picking with my heart here. I hope Magomedov is still the man. And if he's still the man, give me Magomedov to beat Stoltzfus by third round submission. He's going to be bigger and stronger. And he's the kind of guy that he can hurt Stoltzfus on the feet. He can take him down. While I said Stoltzfus is an underratedly good wrestler, Magomedov is an outstanding wrestler, and he's one of those guys that's relentless on the ground. That's where he turns real Dagestani, where he'll get dominant position, hurt you until you have to kind of choose your poison. Do I turn and give my back and just get choked out, or do I stay here and squirm and just get punched out? I think Stoltzfus is going to have that kind of decision to make in the third round. Give me Magomedov by third round TKO on the ground, but third round sub would be equally likely.
Yeah, this is another one. I love seeing a fresh Dagestani in the UFC. As always, these guys, there's such a fun mix of, just like you said, the grinder, the guy that just takes you down, drags down, kind of like the Islam style. And then now sometimes you see guys who throw wheel kicks. Sometimes you see guys who are way more aggressive on the ground. So I think he's definitely in that camp of the breed of more exciting guys to hail out of Dagestan. And you mentioned that Stoltzfus has kind of had a brutal stretch of matchmaking, which he certainly has. But this is kind of a case when you look at a guy like Abus Magomedov, where I actually like the matchmaking, because we have seen guys who we know are something in the UFC. Kyle Dawkins, Vieira, Gerald Meerschaert have their way with Stoltzfus. And so this is the opportunity for Magomedov to say, look, I'm as good, if not better, as those guys. Look what they did to him. Look what I did to him. And for Stoltzfus, it's weird to say a guy who's 1-3 in the UFC has almost like a gatekeeper role, but that's kind of the role he's playing in this fight, where if Magomedov struggles against him or can't get by him, then that quick path to a title shot, like you mentioned, I think we're not going to be looking at that. He's probably not going to be looking at a title shot anytime soon. Like you said, 31 years old, a long layoff, almost a year off, been really tough for him to get that first debut in the UFC. He was probably, I can't imagine how he was feeling when another opponent pulled out on him before they had Stoltzfus. But so if he does struggle in this fight, my personal hopes for him getting that title shot would be dampered. But yeah, if he ragdolls him, then it's like, okay, we have a guy in this 185-pound division, kind of to a lesser extent of Alex Pereira, of course, but could in a couple fights, we see him, you're already fighting for a contender spot or even a shot at the title. And for Stoltzfus, if Magomedov is still that guy he looked like in PFL, then you do have to feel for him from a matchmaking perspective, because he'll be 1-4 fighting some really good guys, and he just got the short end of the stick in his career. Really didn't have an opportunity to fly. So you imagine the back's kind of up against the wall for him, which does bode well for him. So I do expect to see a really gritty performance out of him because of that. But like you said, Magomedov is a beast. He ragdolls people, aggressive fighter. So I think the talent discrepancy is just going to be too big. But I think still expect to see a really tough, gritty performance out of Stoltzfus. So give me Magomedov by decision.
There you go. And kind of clever on the part of Stoltzfus, because he is 1-3 in the UFC, but the UFC doesn't usually cut people off of a loss where they stepped up on short notice. So he's almost playing with house money here, where, if he wins or he gives Magomedov a hard time, he looks great. If he gets splattered, well, hey, you did the UFC a solid. They're probably not going to cut you off of that. Especially considering he's 1-3, he's probably on the first fight of a new 4-fight deal. They're probably not going to cut him off of that. So smart play, Mr. Stoltzfus. We salute you. Next up, we have a lightweight matchup between Perez Ziam and the debuting Michal Figlak. Ziam, the 25-year-old Frenchman, is 12-4 overall. He is an even 2-2 in the UFC. He lost his last time out. That was a first-round rear naked choke submission at the hands of Terrence McKinney back in February at UFC Fight Night, Makdessi versus Green. Prior to that, he had won 2 straight over Luigi Vendramini and Jamie Mullarkey, both of those by unanimous decision. Vendramini by majority decision, Mullarkey by unanimous decision. He'll be taking on the debuting Figlak, 26-year-old Pole fighting out of the UK, coming up through Cage Warriors. He is a perfect 8-0 in his mixed martial arts career. As I said, this will be his UFC debut, but he's 8-0. The last 6 of those in Cage Warriors. Honestly, he may have only been one more win away from a Cage Warriors lightweight title shot, but nonetheless, he's making his UFC debut here. Odds, Figlak -200, so he's a 2-1 favorite over the veteran. Well, say veteran, about a 25-year-old. He's a 2-1 favorite over the UFC veteran Ziam. And I'll say I understand why. Perez Ziam, he's 2-2 in the UFC, and as far as I can see, the wins and losses aren't really down to talent so much as approach. Like Ziam, he wins when his opponent lets him fight his fight. When his opponent takes him out of what he wants to do in any way, he loses. Like, I think Jamie Mullarkey is a better fighter than Perez Ziam. I just, I think he's physically at least as gifted. I think he's probably more skilled, more places. But Ziam beat him just because Mullarkey didn't force the issue. Terrence McKinney forced the issue. Ziam never got comfortable. Ziam is the kind of long, lanky, range kickboxer that does not react well to being put on his back foot, does not react well to being rushed at. And there's nothing unique about that. I mean, Edson Barboza has one of the greatest highlight reels in the history of the sport, and he arguably has never really adjusted to people just coming forward and forcing him to fight off his back foot. A lot of kickboxers never do. That's Ziam's problem. He's long and rangy. He's accurate, but doesn't have a whole ton of power. So he's really dependent on his footwork and on his opponent's sufferance to keep things at his preferred range. If somebody wants to come at him, so far he's not shown the power to really dissuade them, and doesn't always have the footwork to keep them off him. That spells trouble against Michal Figlak, because if there's something that Figlak is going to do, it is come straight the hell at Perez Ziam. Michal Figlak, he and his brother are both in Cage Warriors. They're both Polish, but have basically fought their entire careers out of England. His brother, Mateusz, is welterweight, so, they're close to the same size. Michal Figlak is a powerful kickboxer who throws everything hard. He comes forward immediately, and he uses feints to kind of draw his opponents out. He's very much what Keith, if he were here, would call a pressure counter striker. He's coming forward. He's feigning to try to draw a reaction out of his opponent so he can throw the offense he really wants to. He has big kicks. I mean, if you look at the guy, he's got the thighs of like Kevin Randleman. It is ridiculous. I mean, I think he's only about 5'8". I'm certain that this dude could dunk a basketball. Keith and I have argued over whether Paul Craig can dunk a basketball. Like, yeah, he's 6'4", but he's the worst athlete in the division. Do you think Paul Craig can dunk a basketball? I have no question that Michal Figlak can dunk a basketball. I don't know if he's ever even held a basketball, but you give him that and say, throw it in that 10-foot hoop. He's like, I got this. That's the legs on this man. Given that, I mean, he could throw more kicks and probably be effective with them, but what he prefers is punches. He comes forward, feinting with his jab, almost pawing with it sometimes. He's usually fighting someone with reach on him, so he'll kind of paw out with the jab, do a little hand fighting, feint with the jab, and draw them out so that he can throw lead left hook, throw his right cross. He will throw kicks. His leg kicks and body kicks are both really hard, and he's good on the ground. He's surprisingly adept at bringing things to the ground, but he prefers to keep things on the feet. So at least Ziam won't have to worry about that probably. But I think this is just going to be bad news for Ziam because I don't think he's going to be comfortable the whole fight unless he's really made a leaps and bounds change in his approach and his skills since the Vendramini fight last summer, because Karis McKinney blew through him in like 2 minutes, and most of what we saw was on the ground, and Ziam was hopeless. But, you know, there's always a chance that at age 24, now 25, he really has like developed some more of his natural power, become more confident, worked, you know, on his footwork. But I'm not betting on it. I think this is a good matchup for Figlak. Ziam's not been knocked out at the UFC level yet. I'm not going to pick Figlak to do that in his debut, but give me Figlak to win all 3 rounds. Ziam never to really be able to unleash the rangy kicking that he wants to. Just Figlak's going to be in his face, tagging him with probably, you know, his right cross a lot of times, probably chopping at his legs, and give me Figlak to win all 3 rounds with a pretty straightforward decision.
Yeah, what stands out to me in this one, you talked about it, is just the kicks of Figlak. You saw him use them really effectively in Cage Warriors, and he kicks people freaking hard, man. But another thing I like to look at with guys like this is 8-0 coming out of Cage Warriors. With how good of a promotion Cage Warriors is, you would think they obviously have a very good track record in the UFC, but we've also seen guys come in very hyped up off of Cage Warriors and struggle. We saw if you look at the Contender Series a few weeks ago, Jack Cartwright was a guy who, if you were a Cage Warriors fan, you thought that this guy was a sure thing for the UFC, and he struggled a lot in his fight against Jose Johnson. So I wonder, with Figlak, is he gonna be one of those guys who are like, oh, yeah, that's why you're an 8-0 guy, or is there gonna be some growing pains with him in the UFC? But stylistically, I do think this is a tough one for Ziam. Like you said, when guys kind of force the issue on him, that's when he struggles. And I think you really hit the nail on the head saying he won't be comfortable in there. He's gonna be getting kicked a lot. Figlak is gonna push the pace on him. I think if he does knock him out, it's just gonna because he warmed down over the course of 2-3 rounds. But I don't have the confidence to pick a guy making his UFC debut to knock out a 4-fight veteran. So I will go decision, but I always do love these fights where you got the guy who's had a couple fights, hasn't looked the best, and he's getting fed to the hot prospect coming up, because it's like, all right, you had your 4 fights, you're 2-2. Now we're really going to test you with a guy who we think this should be a stepping stone for you. Can you take out the guy making his debut? And I don't think Ziam is the guy that's going to live up to that challenge. So give me Figlak by decision.
There you go. 2 pretty confident picks for Michal Figlak to make a successful UFC debut. Next up at UFC Paris is a middleweight matchup between Nassourdine Imavov and Joaquin Buckley. Imavov, the 27-year-old MMA factory product, is 11-3 overall. He is 3-1 in the UFC. He's on a 2-fight win streak since his lone UFC loss to Phil Hawes. Those 2 wins are over Ian Heinisch, whom he defeated last July at UFC on ESPN, Sandhagen versus Dillashaw, and Edmund Shabazian, whom he defeated at UFC 268 last November. Both of those were second-round TKOs. He will be meeting Buckley. The 28-year-old Missouri native is 15-4 overall. He is 5-2 in the UFC. He is on a 3-fight win streak. Those 3 coming over Antonio Arroyo, Abdulrazak Alhassan, and Albert Duraev. The most recent of those, the Duraev win, was back in June at UFC on ESPN, Cater versus Emmett. Those 3 wins have got him back on track since his shocking first-round knockout loss to Alessio de Chirico, whom we'll be talking about a little later this evening. Odds on this one heavily favor Imavov. He is minus 260. Buckley plus 220 as the substantial underdog. Noah, I'll toss this to you first. Who have you got in this one? It's a couple of finishers and, frankly, exciting fringe guys just right outside that middleweight top 15. Who gets it done?
Yeah, I love the matchmaking here. This is an awesome fight. We talked about the bout order. I know nothing's finalized, but I really hope they pull the trigger on bumping this one up in the card. I think this would be a perfect fight to kind of segue us right into that Whitaker-Vettori card. But as of right now, they've got it kind of down there on the prelims. So I'm rooting for a change there, but not hopeful. If you look at a guy like Imavov, we talked about that middleweight title picture about how UFC is just desperate for someone to challenge Israel Adesanya, someone, a fresh face in there. I think he's a great candidate to be that guy. He's ranked inside the top 15 right now, and I think with this win, we could be looking at a really big step up in competition for him. Maybe fight a Derek Brunson type guy to see if he's ready for that title shot. And for Buckley, coming off 3 straight wins, I do think this is a little bit of a tough matchup for him. He likes to walk guys down, throw big looping punches. I don't know how that's going to go for him against a guy like Imavov. Imavov is not your typical Dagestani wrestler. He's got really good submissions, but he's not really looking to grind you up against the fence and drag you into deep water from there. Like I said, he throws his combinations hard, really crisp, linear striking. So I think when you have a guy like Buckley who's going to look to throw those long looping punches and shots he loads up on, he's very powerful, but I don't think he's going to be able to get to Imavov. I think Imavov's going to beat him up the middle a lot of times in these exchanges. And I think whenever Buckley pushes the action, he's going to get hit with some pretty nasty counter shots. So, and I think Imavov, given the matchup on the feet, favoring Imavov, I think that he's gonna have enough to get him out of there. I think he's gonna catch him within the first 2 rounds. Buckley's super durable, tough guy, so I don't want to say round 1. So give me Imavov in the second round for this one.
And you've got a KO or TKO in that one?
KO.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I understand why the matchup favors Imavov. I understand why the odds are what they are, but I said this ahead of Buckley's last fight against Albert Duraev. Even as I was picking Duraev in that fight, it is never comfortable picking against Joaquin Buckley. And if I were more of a betting man, I would never touch a favorite over Buckley because you're never going to be comfortable. Just, he has what, if you don't think it's the greatest knockout in UFC history, it's at least in the team photo. It's on the Mount Rushmore. That, spinning hook kick of Impa Kasanganay that was the viral moment of the, that 2020 year of COVID. One of the, again, one of the greatest knockouts we've ever seen. And he's done that sort of thing to multiple fighters, just explodes out of nowhere with fight-ending strikes, with any limb, from any angle, from unexpected angles. It's always a bit of a cliche and usually a little overstated that power's the great equalizer. All this guy needs is one punch or one kick, but it's literally true with Joaquin Buckley. And that for the most part, it overcomes all of his other limitations, because if I give you a rundown of the problems with Joaquin Buckley, which I'm about to do, all of them are, but Buckley is undersized. The first exposure I had to Joaquin Buckley as a fighter was I interviewed Logan Storley ahead of their fight back in Bellator back in 2018. And, Storley is an undersized welterweight, though you can't say that to him. He doesn't like it. Sorry, Logan. But even he was taller than Buckley, and obviously as the much more credentialed wrestler, he just, he steamrolled him. He he spread Buckley on the floor like just, avocado toast. Which made Buckley seem like an unlikely candidate for a move up to 185. At 185, he's 5'8". He gives up reach to everybody he fights. He probably gives up in-cage weight to everybody he fights. His wrestling was okay at 170. It's, defensive wrestling, a little bit of a liability at 185. He's a surprisingly good offensive wrestler. I say all of that, and he himself is quite hittable. Alessio Di Chirico just iced him with an unblocked head kick. Kevin Holland pieced him up. But even the people he's beaten, like most of them have landed cleanly on him at some point. Jordan Wright hit him a lot. But again, all that, but Joaquin Buckley literally just needs one shot to either end the fight or turn all the momentum on a dime, which he's done in several fights. It was heartening to see him against Abdul Razak Al Hassan kind of turn a little bit to his wrestling. In fact, a wrestle fest between Buckley and Al Hassan was the last thing I expected, but it's kind of what we got. I think because both guys respected the other's knockout power so much. That's a little bit heartening, but it all spells trouble against Imavov. Imavov, I'm not saying he should be, but he could easily be 4-0 in the UFC right now. Yeah, he lost that majority decision to Phil Hawes. Some people scored that fight for Imavov. Like, I don't think a majority did, but you go to MMA decisions, there were plenty of professionals that thought Imavov won that fight. But more importantly, Hawes was saved by the bell at the end of that fight. Like, Imavov was seconds away from finishing that thing. Imavov could have finished him in the second round. And if he had done either of those things, or even just come out on the opposite end of that majority decision, he's probably fighting for a title next. Like, Alex Pereira is probably on the back burner, and Nassourdine Imavov with 4 straight wins in the UFC middleweight division, he's probably next in line to fight Israel Adesanya. So Imavov is just he's better physically equipped for this division. He has a more well-rounded skill set, and while never say never with, again, Joaquin Buckley's power, but Imavov withstood all of Phil Hawes' artillery in the first round. And Phil Hawes is another guy with just shocking, crushing punching power. And Imavov, his chin was on the gunnery range for that whole first round. He was fine and came back to arguably win the fight. If I were a betting man, this is the one Buckley fight where I'd consider sticking Imavov in my parlay, but do not take my betting advice, or your kid's college education is gone out the window. So don't take this as betting advice, but this is a pretty good matchup for Imavov. I'm not comfortable he gets a knockout because Buckley, in spite of throwing everything incredibly hard, his gas tank has not really betrayed him in any of these fights. He's still throwing effective offense in the third round. He's still able to wrestle offensively and defensively. So I think he's going to be game. I think he's going to be in there, but Imavov wins a decision where it gets increasingly lopsided looking as we go along, and maybe even we get a near finish or a 10-8 third round. But yeah, Imavov big time in this one. And if Buckley makes me look like an ass for the second fight in a row, because this is exactly what I said Albert Duraev was going to do to him, you'll hear all about it on the Sherdog recap. But for now, I have not learned my lesson yet. Give me Imavov. We head now to the lightweight division, and a meeting between two men who reached that division from opposite directions, as it is former welterweight Benoit Saint-Denis welcoming former featherweight Gabriel Miranda to the UFC. Saint-Denis, the 26-year-old Frenchman, is 9-1 with 1 no contest overall. He is 1-1 since joining the UFC. He debuted at UFC 267 last October. He lost a unanimous decision to Eliseu Capoeira in one of the beatdowns of 2021, one of the more controversial moments of 2021, which I'll get to in a moment. He came back from that with a second round submission win over Nicholas Stoltzfus back in June at UFC Fight Night Volkov versus Rosenstrike. He is going to drop from welterweight to lightweight and try to keep the good times rolling against the debuting Miranda. Miranda, 32-year-old Brazilian, is 16-5 overall. This will be his UFC debut. He joins the UFC on a 3-fight win streak, including a win in Brave CF, one of the feeder orgs par excellence over the last two and a half years or so of the COVID era, but all 3 by submission. That's unsurprising because 15 of his 16 career wins are by submission. And he is going to try to have a successful UFC debut. The bookmakers do not think he gets it, as Santini is minus 275, Miranda plus 235 on the comeback. Benoit Santini, he had a hard look in his UFC debut. They put him against Eliseu Capoeira. I believe Santini was stepping up on short notice. I think he was a short notice signing. And that fight is memorable, one, because of the horrific, hellacious beating that Eliseu Zaleski dos Santos put on him, where by the end of the fight, the only controversy was over whether we had a 10-7 or a 10-8 round in there, and over whether it was the fault of Santini's corner for not stopping the fight or the fault of the ref. Most people agreed it was the ref's fault. That one famously, Slava Kiselev, a busy ref in Russia, the CIS, and Eastern Europe, got yoinked from the card from the rest of his assignments that night. One of the worst moments of reffing in recent memory in the UFC. But he came back from that and looked much better against Nicholas Stoltza, and he looked like what he is. A long, lanky, like he's not that tall for the weight class, although he will be, pretty tall for 155 at 5'11" or 6 feet or so. But, seems longer on the ground. He's kind of a long-armed, long-legged guy who's opportunistic, definitely wants it on the ground, doesn't always have the means to get it there. He kind of has, he's French. I don't mean to throw shade, but I'm an American. I'm a former wrestler. He doesn't wrestle like an American. At best, he's got that kind of Michael Chiesa long, tall man takedown game where, he'll grab a single collar tie and snatch a single, or, work in get a body lock, get, underhooks and just use his superior height to kind of tip the guy over. That's more of his takedown game. He's going against a guy in Miranda that I'm surprised to see Miranda make his UFC debut. He's the kind of guy I didn't figure he'd ever make it. He's past 30. He has a highlight reel to be envied. This dude's highlight reel is very impressive, but a lot of it's been against kind of lower level competition. This is another case, kind of like Ailin Perez versus Zara Ferran dos Santos, where I think they're bringing Miranda in to be a winnable fight for Benoit Santini, because the last thing you want to do with your first card ever in France is have all the French people get thrashed. It's bad enough that we lost Manon Fior from this card, and it got pushed down the way, because that would have been a suitable co-main event. But the last thing you want is for Cyril Gane to win, and then the rest of your French fighters go 0 for 6 or whatever. So, but if you were just trying to bring in someone to be a squash match for Benoit Santini, this is a weird choice. Gabriel Miranda is kind of a true old school Brazilian grappling specialist. He fights out of orthodox stance, uses lots of feints, comes forward, but he comes forward and he uses lots of feints because he's trying to draw his opponents out to get them to commit to something so that he can, change levels and try to bring the thing to the ground. On the ground, he has a creative and venomous submission game. He's dangerous from everywhere. I'm going to make a comparison here, and please understand that I am not saying that Gabriel Miranda is the next blank, but his ground game reminds me of Charles de Bronx Oliveira before de Bronx before his last 8 or 9 fight run where he finally just turned the corner and became one of the best fighters in the world. But when de Bronx was just kind of hanging out in the middle of the roster and would have weird performances where he looked awful, but then would have performances where he reminded us that he's maybe the greatest grappler in MMA history. That's Miranda. I'm not saying he's as good, but he's the kind of guy that he's comfortable everywhere. He is a submission threat everywhere, but he's not a guy that will just play jiu-jitsu off his back. He can get submissions from his back, but if he tries his first idea, second idea, they don't work, he's not going to camp out and just lose a round throwing up, half-assed arm bars and triangles, he'll then go to sweep. On top, he is positionally aware, he's positionally sound, but aggressive in going for the sub. Again, he's 16-5. He's never been to the judges in a win. He has one TKO, and I think that one was even a TKO on the ground, like the Damian Maia thing, where like he almost accidentally TKO'd someone, just by hitting him a few too many times. But he wants the submission, and he's got all the techniques. Arm bars, everything that works off the front headlock series. He's got great, Bravo choke, guillotine. He's got the Charles de Bronx type guillotine where he's got kind of long, skinny arms where he gets it in there, locks up his guard, and there's no question, like the dude is tapping in seconds. So far on this card, and again, I don't know what order these fights will end up in, but so far, this is the 6th fight we've talked about. We've picked no upset so far, either of us. I don't know who you're going to pick, so I don't know if we're going to disagree yet, but we haven't disagreed yet. I can't allow that to happen. If we get no other upset calls tonight out of me, I'm calling the upset here. And I know it's a bit of a flyer. Miranda's taking a huge step up in competition. He will be giving up size to Santini as Miranda's fought kind of back and forth between 145 and 155. But give me either Santini to get a little overzealous on the ground, trying to get, a highlight reel finish, maybe a bonus check in front of, his home country, or for Santini to have trouble getting the fight to the ground where and how he wants it. But give me Gabriel Miranda to kind of shock the world, or at least shock the Accor arena. Miranda by 2nd round submission here in a, bigger than 2-1 upset.
I definitely see the temptation and wanting to pull the trigger on Miranda to pick the upset. I can't let myself get all the way there, but I do see, he's got that Brazilian takedown defense game where with versus Quinonez, it's kind
of that Brazilian takedown defense thing, like
they're hard people to take down. But yeah, so he can be tough to get. Definitely a tough dude on the ground. Benoit, like you said, he's definitely an unorthodox wrestler. I think it has to do with his length. So if I could see him kind of do that unorthodox style, leaving himself open to get submitted with the slick BJJ game of Miranda. But at the end of the day, I just can't get past the fact that it's the UFC's first card in France. We've got a 1-1 guy who has shown potential of being an exciting, intriguing fighter coming out of France. In France, the UFC wants this guy to win. And when they want guys to win, I think a lot of the time they get their way. Miranda making his debut, but he's coming out of a Face the Danger. So, not the highest. It's not like we got a guy coming out of the LFA coming in here. So I do agree he has a chance to catch him in a submission, but I just don't think – I think there's still going to be a talent discrepancy. I still think Saint Denis is going to be the more talented fighter. I think he's going to be able to get him down, and I think he's going to have to get out of some submissions. He's going to get into some tough spots. Kind of think when Amanda Nunes was taking down Juliana Pena in that fight, where she was thwarting off a lot of stuff, but I think he's going to get off his ground and pound, and I think he's going to take a decision, but not without some real close calls on the floor.
Okay, let the record show that Noah is throwing shade at Curitiba's 3rd best MMA promotion, and that it's only because he's new here and being nice. If we were recording this show 6 months down the road, once he realizes that my senior editor title doesn't mean I can fire him, he'd be calling me a dumbass right now. But yeah, we have our first ascension of the night on the Miranda versus Anthony fight. We head now to the men's bantamweight division for a matchup between Khalid Taha and late replacement Cristian Quinonez. Taha, the 30-year-old German, is 13-4 with 1 no contest overall. He's 1-3 with 1 no contest in the UFC. Worth noting that no contest was him back in October of 2019, choking out Bruno Silva, and then it being later overturned when he tested positive for a banned diuretic. Since that overturned win, he has lost 2 in a row, those against Hani Barcelos and Sergey Morozov, The most recent of those, the Morozov loss, was a unanimous decision last July at UFC on ESPN, Makhachev versus Moises. He had been scheduled to fight Taylor Lapoulos at UFC Paris. Another case of Taha being brought in as probably a winnable matchup for a local in Lapoulos. Lapoulos falls out, and in steps Cristian Quinonez for his UFC debut. He is a graduate of the 5th season of Dana White's Contender Series, and he is on a 4-fight win streak, including that Contender Series appearance. Prior to that, he'd won a couple of fights in UWC, which is one of the upper but not very top level Mexican promotions. Taha, the slight favorite here. He's minus 150. Quinonez plus 120 on the comeback. Considering that Taha, again, he's brought in to be kind of a tailor-made opponent for Taylor Lapoulos. He's another guy that we just said this earlier about Dustin Stoltzfus. His record on paper does not look good. He's 1-3 with 1 no contest in the UFC, but that is partly due to rough matchmaking. Like Hani Barcelos and Sergey Morozov are a rough pair of matchups back to back. Those are 2 good fighters, and he was at least competitive against them. The win over Bruno Silva should be a huge feather in his cap, but of course it was overturned because he, tested positive for furosemide. So some of his misfortune is of his own making. Some is just matchmaking, and some is just fate. I mean, he's fought basically once a year for the last 3 years. That's not a good look for a guy who's now past 30 and fighting in a division that is not kind to the elderly, for people not named Jose Aldo. I mean, frankly, and when I hand this over to you, I'll ask you what you thought of the Taha versus Lapoulos matchup. But this becomes a less important fight in terms of divisional implications, but it's a much more even fight, and probably will be a more exciting one as he welcomes Quinonez. Khalid Taha, his problem, you look at the guy, and he's a bricked up 135. He's short, powerfully built, squat. Yes, he's German, German born, but his name is Khalid Taha. You think, oh man, maybe this guy's like a second generation, like Iranian or Afghanistan. I bet this guy's like a great wrestler. He's not a great wrestler. I don't know how a guy this short and squat with that low center of gravity can have this bad a takedown defense, but he sure does. He's I've used this term before in talking about Drew Dober, like where he looks wrestly. You look at Drew Dober, this dude from Nebraska, like short, stocky, blonde, jacked with cauliflower ear. You're like, oh yeah, I bet this dude, he like won 2 state titles. He's probably a junior college All-American. And that ain't Drew Dober. Drew Dober's a kickboxer whose takedown defense is kind of iffy. That's Khalid Taha. Taha, he's a hard hitter. You look at him, you'd think, oh, if this guy swings hard, he could probably hit you hard. He does swing hard. He swings hard on everything, but he's come up against a hard ceiling against the better fighters he's fought. Like he, blistered Boston Salmon in like 30 seconds, but Boston Salmon turned out not to be UFC level fighter. He looked great in the fight against Bruno Silva, but again, you know what? Considering that he tested positive for a diuretic, that wouldn't have been a very impressive win if he'd blown weight by 6 pounds or something, which is very possibly the other option. And then against people he couldn't just overwhelm on just his pure physical horsepower, like Barcelos and Morozov, he hasn't beaten them. So I think he is what he is at this point. He's not a prospect. He's over 30. This is his 6th fight in the UFC. He is a mid to low level gatekeeper. He's going to beat your guys that are not UFC material. He's going to be even against your guys that are just another roster guy, and against anyone that has even a hint of top 15 upside, he's probably going to lose. That means we're probably going to have a pretty good fight against Quinonez, because I'm not that high in Quinonez as a prospect. Like he won on the Contender Series, but for as tall and lengthy a guy as he is, who tries to fight at range, he is surprisingly susceptible to his opponent's offense. He gets rung up hard by just about everybody he fights, including some not good dudes in like UWC and Combate. He's a surprisingly good offensive wrestler. Like he's not a plus offensive wrestler, but he's not terrible. He's also a bad defensive wrestler, but that shouldn't come into to play here because I don't think either of these guys is going to try to take things down except maybe in desperation. If Taha catches him with something clean, Quinonez is going to go down. Like Quinonez, again, he's hittable. He keeps his head too high, doesn't always bring his hands back. He himself is a reckless striker offensively, so sometimes he wouldn't be able to bring his hands back in time because he's way out over his feet. But this one should be a whole lot of fun while it lasts. I expect that, Quinonez is going to come out like a house on fire. I expect that Taha is going to be his usual, like, very aggressive self. And with nobody to take down either guy, I think they're just going to kind of swing on each other until somebody gets hurt real bad and either gets knocked out or, again, turns to a desperation takedown. Give me Taha to get it done. And even though I don't think he's a 10 times better fighter than Quinonez, it's just going to look like it because this is going to go to the first guy who lands hard. I'm picking that to be Taha. So give me Taha by first round knockout, but it'll be a lot of fun while it lasts.
Yeah, like you said, Taha was supposed to fight Taylor Lapalus. Just got scratched pretty recently. I had actually had Lapalus winning that fight. I think Cristianez is a much better matchup for him. Lapalus was a guy. It would have been a great redemption story for him. He was removed for the UFC roster, then had the opportunity to come back to France after a pretty good run in Aries in the UFC and get that win in his first fight. I think he would have done it. So kind of disappointed we're not going to get to see that moment. And he was a really rough matchup for Khalid Taha. Taha, like you mentioned, he's got a 2-fight losing streak coming into this, and he's super aggressive, always looking for the finish. He showed flashes of, you mentioned he's got pretty weak takedown defense, but he showed flashes of some offense off his back in his last fight, but he really just got mauled. I don't really think that'll be a factor. I don't think Cristian Quinonez is going to try to take him down, even though he might see in the tape Taha struggle with that takedown defense and maybe try to surprise them. But I don't think that's going to be a big factor in this fight. I see it mainly taking out on the feet. And like you said, Cristian Quinonez just gets hit far too much against a guy like Khalid Taha, who's super reckless and aggressive on the feet. That aggression, I don't think is going to take him very far in his UFC career, except for a fight like this when he's getting fed a guy making his debut who gets hit a lot. So yeah, I think he's going to crack him. I think Quinonez is a tough guy, so may be able to withstand an early onslaught, but I don't think offensively he's going to be able to keep up, and I don't think his defense is there to the point where he's going to be able to survive 15 minutes with Khalid Taha. So give me Taha in the second round knockout in this one.
There you go. 2 pretty strong picks for Khalid Taha to be really happy that he didn't get Taylor Lapalus in this fight.
Yeah.
Next up, it is the featherweights as Charles Jourdain takes on Nathaniel Wood. Jourdain, the 26-year-old from Quebec, is 13-5-1 overall. He is 4-4-1 since joining the UFC as a former 2-division champ in Canada's TKO promotion. He was their featherweight champ as well as their one-time interim lightweight champ. He will be stepping in against Wood. The 29-year-old Brit is 18-5 overall. He is 5-2 in the UFC. Notably, he is 1-0 since stepping up from bantamweight to featherweight. He had gone 4-2 at bantamweight, decided that his best route to a title or to whatever lay one weight class up. So he moved up and he beat Charles Rosa back in July at the second UFC London card by unanimous decision. This is one of the closer fights on the card in terms of betting odds. Jourdain is -140, Wood available +110 as the slight underdog. Noah, I'll toss this one to you. It's the Brit against the guy that I wouldn't be surprised if he walks out with like a Canadian and a French flag and just totally plays to the crowd, because that's very Charles Jourdain type thing to do. But an exciting matchup on paper. Who do you think gets it done and how?
Yeah, Jourdain kind of the honorary Frenchman in this one. Really quick turnaround for both guys. We watched them both fight in kind of mid to late July, so I think it's interesting they matched up 2 guys who are ready to just get right back in there right away. It's one of those fights where I think all the fans, the UFC media, we're all going to know right away if we have something in the winner, and in the loser, I think we're going to know, okay, maybe this guy isn't top caliber material in their division. I think they both at separate points in their career have had some hype behind them, rightfully so. You look at Charles Jourdain. I think there was a lot of upset buzz behind him in his last fight before he fought Shane Burgos. He ended up getting out grappled in that fight, wasn't able to get it done. But nonetheless, I think he deserved that kind of hype. He's a super talented guy, dynamic striker. There's crisp combinations, not afraid to take risks on the feet at all. He'll throw some spinning stuff. He'll throw a flying knee here or there. So I'm excited to see what he's going to do against a fight that I think will take place mostly on the feet, unlike that Shane Burgos fight where he was just kind of taken down and drowned on the ground. He's very dangerous with his left hand, and he struggles when guys put a lot of pressure on him. But when he's the guy pushing the action, I think that's when he really thrives. And he's going up against Nathaniel Wood, who's facing a pretty big step up in competition after his last fight. His last fight, he fought Charles Rosa. He's about a minus 500 favorite in that fight. So he's a slight underdog here against Charles Jourdain. It should be definitely a much tougher matchup for him than Charles Rosa, who he really dominated in that fight. Wood's got some solid kicks, and he's a very good counter striker. In that Rosa fight, like I said, he seemed to know what Rosa was doing before Rosa even did at times. I mean, he completely outclassed the guy. He's got a solid low kick, and I think he's going to use this a lot in this fight to try to slow down the pace that Jourdain will try to push. Yeah, I mean, so I think the calf kicks and the counter strikes of Wood is going to be a problem, but Jourdain's going to be in his face. He's going to be pushing the pace. He's going to be pushing the action. And then if he does that, I think Wood is going to have a really tough time keeping up. So for Wood to win, I think he's going to have to catch him on a counter and knock him out. And I don't see him landing that fatal blow. So I think Charles Jourdain is going to outvolley him, outstrike him, wear him down over the course of 3 rounds. So give me him by a unanimous decision.
Outstanding. This is, again, like I said off the top, this is one of the closer fights on the card in terms of the odds. And so I'd love to be able to jump in and say, hey, here's your value pick, take Wood. But if anything, I'm surprised that the odds aren't a little wider here. This is going to be a major step up in competition for Wood, because Wood is in his featherweight debut, fought Charles Rosa, who, not saying this to be mean, but is one of the lower level featherweights on UFC roster. Just, anyone with a pulse has kind of done what they wanted to Charles Rosa. And he's facing someone in Jourdain that, yeah, he's a 500 fighter in the UFC, but he's got a couple of really good wins. Just, Andre Ewell, Lando Venata, especially the way he did it. If we roll back a couple of years, sparking Du Ho Choi, he's been fighting a higher level of competition, and he's looked better against them. And not for nothing, but I thought he beat Shane Burgos. Like, I was surprised at the success Shane Burgos had on the ground, especially in the second round. But I scored that fight for Jourdain, and Jourdain was putting it on him in the third round. Like, regardless of how you scored it in the end, because the first round was kind of the swing round there, like, Jourdain was lighting him up in the third round. Like, the third round was the one round where it looked like a Shane Burgos fight, and Burgos was getting the worst of it. Jourdain, the Air nickname, I want to hate the nickname because nicknames that are just a simple pun on somebody else's name, it's like, get out of here. But it fits him because he has a high-flying game, and that's not really gone away. I mean, the guy still will just, like, throw a flying knee in the first 10 or 15 seconds of every fight. He loves his flying strikes. He hit, I think, Andre Ewell with, like, a flying head kick. He, likes his spinning stuff. And interestingly, like, he retains the ability to throw those techniques pretty far into a fight, even though they clearly take a lot of energy out of him. The Venata fight also showed that he's surprisingly dangerous on the ground for a guy who presents, again, as a high-flying striker. He's hit his ceiling against the kind of contender level fighters he's fought, or, apparently hit a ceiling again, like, the Burgos fight. But against everyone else, he's looked pretty damn good. And he's taking on someone in Wood that I like the fact that he's stepping up to 145. I'm always a fan of fighters voluntarily moving up in weight because they think their body will work better at that weight, not being forced up because they miss weight, or just can no longer make the cut. I always like fighters choosing to do that. But Wood, he's never been a plus athlete. He wasn't a plus athlete for the bantamweight division. He won't be for the featherweight division. And against Jourdain, the difference in speed, I think, is going to be shocking. And it's never a good look when you're smaller the smaller and the slower fighter in a fight. Like it's perfect that Wood is a protege of Brad Pickett because there are parallels. Brad Pickett in the WEC days, he had the whole, like pikey boxer from Snatch thing with like the hat, and he called himself One Punch Pickett. But that was a joke. He never one punched anybody. He was a grinder. Hell, until Leon Edwards came along, I think you can argue that Brad Pickett was the best MMA wrestler the British Isles ever produced. Yeah, like his nickname was almost like a distraction to like get his opponents to expect something other than what was coming. And it's similar with Wood. Like he sets up like another kind of like just hard-nosed British boxer, but he's a natural grinder as well. I just don't know if he's going to get the chance to do that against Jourdain. If he forces close quarters boxing against Jourdain, we talked already on this card about people like Perez, Ziam that are rangy kickboxers that don't respond well to being crowded. Jourdain doesn't love it, but he does, he will throw inside intercepting knees. He will, like he has more weapons inside and seems more comfortable there. If Wood grabs the clinch, he's going to be grabbing the clinch against a taller, heavier guy. And if things go to the ground, again, Jourdain, surprisingly aggressive grappler. I think this is it's going to go to Jourdain, and I think it's going to go more lopsidedly than the odds would seem to indicate. I don't know if Jourdain gets a highlight reel knockout or another sassy submission, but I think he's going to prove to be kind of the superior fighter in terms of physical tools for the whole time. The only thing that gives me any pause is that, as you mentioned, this is a relatively short turnaround for both men. And we have someone in Jourdain that probably has a pretty substantial weight cut against someone in Wood who probably does not. This is his second fight since moving up from bantamweight. His body hasn't changed a whole lot. So I suspect that he has much less weight to cut, if really any appreciable amount. So if he is able to really step on the gas in the third round, he could make things interesting. But I don't think it's even going to get to the point where the third round there's much suspense going into the third round. Give me Jourdain to win a pretty lopsided decision here.
Yeah, I agree.
The UFC Paris main card powers on with a lightweight matchup between John Makdessi and Nasrat Haqparast. Makdessi, the 37-year-old Canadian, is 18-7 overall. He's 11-7 in the UFC. He won his last time out. It was a split decision win over Ignacio Bahamondes at UFC on ABC Vettori versus Holland back in April. Prior to that, his last appearance had been last March, where he dropped a unanimous decision to Francisco Trinaldo. He'll be taking on Haqparast. The 27-year-old German is 13-5 overall. He's 5-4 in the UFC. He is on a 2-fight losing streak, those coming against Dan Hooker and Bobby Green. The most recent of those, the Green loss, was at UFC 271 back in February. So he's going to try to get things turned around against John the Bull. He is favored to do so. Haqparast minus 220 right now. Makdessi plus 175. I mentioned earlier that occasionally I'll just almost forget about a fighter's existence just because this is such a fast-moving carousel, and the UFC has 600 fighters on roster. Makdessi is a guy that I never forget he exists, but every time they announce a fight for him, I'm like, oh, is he still in the UFC? And then I realized, okay, not only has he not been cut, but he's won 4 of his last 5. And it's just easy to forget how competitive and just kind of how underratedly accomplished he is, because this guy was unaffected by COVID because he'd already been fighting once a year for like the last 7 years. You go back through his record. It's like fought once in 2021, once in 2020, just once a year, going all the way back to, I think, like 2015. He's just been a once a year fighter, due in part to, a succession of injuries. He's another guy that, he's pushing 40 in a division that isn't always kind to aging fighters. So for a guy like him, who at his best has kind of like flirted with the outer edges of the rankings, he's just not busy enough to he's not busy enough to like stick in my memory as someone who watches all the fights, or in the average fan's memory, or in UFC matchmakers' memory. Even having won 4 of his last 5, he's getting passed up on the ladder to contention by busier fighters who they've been, 4-1 in their last 5 fights in the last 18 months, whereas it took him 5 years. But we were reminded against Ignacio Bahamondes just how competitive he is and just how well-rounded and tough. Against Bahamondes, he's facing an almost laughable size disparity. As you know, Ignacio Bahamondes is this titanic, like 6'2" lightweight with enormous reach that fights rangy. And Makdessi was able to navigate his range. He was able to hit him on the feet. He wasn't like outmatched on the ground, and he won a split decision. And that's the one where, I think I scored that one for Makdessi. He lost to Trinaldo. I forgot that fight because it was one of the worst fights I ever saw. Like so many Trinaldo fights, just I love the guy, but his fights are death. If he's still the guy he was when he fought Bahamondes, which again, that's 15 months ago. I think he's had 2 birthdays since then. There's no guarantee that he hasn't fallen off a cliff. But if he's still that guy, he gives Nasrat Haqparast a good, tough fight. If he slipped at all, Haqparast maybe washes this guy. Nasrat Haqparast has been in the UFC long enough and like has enough kind of stick in your memory moments that he's almost the opposite of Makdessi. It's like, I can't believe he's only 27. Haqparast, he came to the UFC and he stuck out mostly for looking like Kelvin Gastelum. But since then, he's stood out for being a good boxer with like good power in both hands and kind of a classic sprawl and brawler. He's been good at keeping the fight on the feet against people who wanted to get him to the ground. And where he's hit his wall is just against better strikers. You look at his UFC losses, and aside from like Marcin Held in his debut, literally like 5 years ago at this point, he's lost to Drew Dober, just a better striker than him with more power. He's lost to Dan Hooker, a better striker who had like a reach advantage on him and was a bad matchup, even to just the kind of specific nuance of their striking. Like just the fight, more of it happened at Hooker's preferred range. And then against Bobby Green in one of Bobby Green's just in the zone moments, that's one of, I think, twice in my entire time covering mixed martial arts that I've changed my pick on a fight during fight week based on the energy a fighter was giving off in person, because I covered that one in person. And I was like, going into it, I was like, this is exactly the kind of fight that Bobby Green will find a way to lose by split decision, even though he's the better fighter. And after talking to him a few times, I'm like, no, Bobby Green's dialed in. He's going to bust up Haqparast, and he did. That doesn't really change who Haqparast is. And Haqparast is a bad matchup for Makdessi because they're both going to want to box. They both can kick, but they're both going to want to box. Haqparast has more. He's younger. He's 10 years younger. He's got a longer reach. He's got more natural power. Like Makdessi, has starched some people, but Makdessi gets his power by swinging hard. Haqparast just gets his power from just kind of having natural power and from throwing with like pretty clean technique. That all spells bad news for Makdessi. I'm going to assume that Makdessi is more or less the same guy he was last April, and give me Haqparast to win a pretty lopsided decision where Makdessi's pretty busted up by the end, has been kind of frustrated on the feet for most of the fight. But yeah, Makdessi's surprised me a few times in the past. If he surprises me on Saturday, good for him, but I will believe it when I see it. Give me Haqparast by a one-sided decision.
Yeah, I mean, good for John Makdessi still doing it. Like you said, he just keeps chugging along. Like with how old he is and how long he's been in the UFC, you'd think he'd have one of those, 50 fight records. That's just not the case for him. He's very consistently inactive, I would say. But I want to know how long at his age, he's in his late 30s. How does a year plus layoff affect him at this stage in his career? Like you said, if he is slipping at all, this is a tough matchup for him. So you kind of have to gamble if you're taking him that's not the case with him. He is coming off a very impressive win over a much younger guy. Normally, one of the things that the wise guys in their picking fights look at is they love a guy who's so substantially younger than his opponent. But for Makdessi, he's shown to be able to thwart that, especially in his last fight against Bahamondes. He's never been much of a submission threat. He really likes to stand in the pocket and bang. If you remember his Cowboy Cerrone fight way back in the day where he got called up to fight Cowboy in his prime on short notice, I mean, he just stood there in the pocket and and banged with the guy for the entire fight. I think he went the distance with him. He ate some big head kicks in that fight. So that's really a nutshell of who he is. He's a high output guy. He threw 257 strikes in his last fight. He's going to he's going to stand in the pocket. He's going to throw. He's going to throw hard. And I don't, and assuming father time's not tapping him on the shoulder, I don't see him slowing down as the fight goes on. You'd have to argue, again, 37 extensive UFC career. This could be one of the last few times we see him fight. So I think he might have some extra motivation with that. And when it comes to Haqparast, he is coming off 2 straight losses to Dan Hooker and Bobby Green. Definitely a step down in competition for him. But this is one of those fights for him where now you're fighting John Makdessi. Were those 2 losses because Hooker and Green are just better fighters than you? They're top tier guys right now, and you're not? Or is it that maybe you just don't have the talent? So that's what we're going to learn in this fight. When he is taking guy that the matchup favors him, he should be in John Makdessi. Haqparast, he's got really good power, 9 career knockouts, showed really good counters in a lot of his fights. So I'm interested to see if he's able to get those off in a fight that I really think is going to take place largely in the pocket. But for him, he has struggled with guys who put some pressure on him. Like you said, the Bobby Green fight, Bobby Green was in his face the whole time, and that's where Makdessi's going to be. He's going to be in the pocket, in his face the whole time. So Makdessi, he's coming off a win, a year layoff. The momentum, career momentum is in his favor. I think I'm going to pick the upset here. I think this thing takes place largely in the pocket, and I think the volume of Makdessi, I think he's going to wear him down. And if he doesn't get hit with some huge counter strike, I think he's going to be able to take a really close decision of a fight that just goes down in the pocket, high output fight. And I think he's going to put a lot of pressure on him, throw a lot of strikes, and I think he's going to take a unanimous decision. John Makdessi.
There we go. Noah, the G-Man, stepping forward on the main card with the upset pick. So if you lay down your hard-earned cash and you cash on that one, make sure to send him, a nice thank you note, courtesy of his social media handle that is below his face right now. If you blow your hard-earned money because he's wrong, don't send him any messages at all, because that's not cool.
That works.
Next up at UFC Fight Night, Gane versus Tuivasa, and at least as the card is currently constituted as of the beginning of fight week, the featured fight of the evening is a middleweight matchup between Alessio Di Chirico and Roman Kopylov. Di Chirico, the 32-year-old Italian, is 13-6 overall. He is 4-6 since joining the UFC. He's lost 4 of his last 5. It helps him that the one win in those 5 was that shocking head kick knockout of Joaquin Buckley last January on the first UFC on ABC card. Since then, he's come back and he himself got head kicked by Abdul Razak Al Hassan. That was last August at UFC on ESPN, Barboza versus Chikadze. That just took 17 seconds. And since then, he's been on the shelf. He comes back after just a little over a year to face Kopylov. The 31-year-old Siberian is 8-2 overall. He is 0-2 since joining the UFC as the outgoing Fight Night's global middleweight champ. Those 2 losses, a third round submission loss to Carl Roberson back in November of 2019. Then he came back all the way last Halloween weekend and dropped a unanimous decision to Albert Duraev, who Wait, is Albert Duraev on this card? No, he's not. Okay. That he came back last Halloween weekend at UFC 267 and dropped a unanimous decision to Albert Duraev. He will try to avoid making it 3 in a row here. He is not favored to do so, as this is one of the closer fights on the card on the books, but Di Chirico right now, -120 as your slight favorite. Kopylov available at even money, +100 at quite a few outlets. Man, I'm just going to say that it may be an absolute banger of a fight. Like it may be your fight of the night. It may be super exciting. We may get a knockout of the year candidate type finish out of it. Who knows? But in terms of divisional relevance, in terms of quality, this is rough for a third fight from the top on a UFC card, free card or not. Like, Di Chirico is a guy who is 4-6 in the UFC, was actually cut once and brought back, and he's not been world's better since then. And Kopylov, quietly one of the more disappointing prospect signings in the UFC over the last couple of years. So This is a rough one. I mean, it's rare that you find what might be a pink slip derby this far up a UFC card. Like there's every chance that the loser of this fight might be cut, and that's something rare. Again, third from the top of a UFC card in 2022. But DeCirico, the head kick knockout of Joaquin Buckley is just one of the biggest aberrations I can think of in terms of not just who won, but how they won. Like, if you were to say that, okay, Joaquin Buckley and Alessio DeCirico are about to fight. Oh, DeCirico's on a 3-fight losing streak. One of these guys wins by head kick knockout in 2 minutes. You're guessing it's Buckley. It was just one of the strangest things because DeCirico, even in his wins, that's not been how he's done it. He's a grinder. He's a big, powerfully built guy. I mean, his nickname is Manzo, which in Italian means beef. And that makes all the sense in the world when you look at the guy, between his like jacked physique and kind of his like ears and his cheekbones. He looks like a muscular elf. I don't know, how or why, but that's always the impression I get from him. But he's not a plus athlete. He's kind of slow and plodding on the feet. He has power when he lands, but just he never really had the kind of game that would lead you to expect him to land an unblocked head kick on Joaquin Buckley. And against Abdulrazak Alhassan, he had no chance to prove whether that was a fluke because Alhassan did it to him in 17 seconds. So I'm going to kind of toss both those out and assume he's the same guy that, lost 3 in a row against like Kevin Holland, Mahmoud Muradov, Zach Cummings, a plodding guy that, he's a willing boxer on the feet, but generally slower of hand and foot than his opponent. A pretty good offensive wrestler, but susceptible to being taken down and without a super great get-up game in spite of just being a big, strong guy. Like, DeCirico is a kind of borderline UFC talent who still has a job because of that incredible knockout against Buckley. He's a known quantity to me. The unknown quantity is Kopylov. We talked earlier about Abus Magomedov and just how kind of frustrating and disappointing his slow arrival in the UFC has been. Kopylov is similar. Like the UFC, when they signed him out of Fight Nights Global back in, it was right at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019 that they signed him. He had won the title. They signed him. He was 28 years old and kind of like Magomedov. He was a knockout artist and on the feet like a monster. You could tell that he spent some time with Alexander Shlemenko during his come up, like throws wild stuff on the feet, everything with tons of power. Just a really exciting guy who had the wrestling and could always use it as a safety valve, but preferred to use it to stay on the feet and wallop you. A Siberian fighter more in the mold of like, your Petr Yan or Shlemenko, rather than your like Dagestani who's like grind and grapple first. That was an exciting addition to the middleweight division, and they signed him right out of the gate. He gets tapped out by a kickboxer without a very good ground game in Carl Roberson. He then disappears for 2 full years, like the whole year of COVID. He had the hat trick as well. He got injured, he got COVID, he had a visa issue, which is kind of the perfect trifecta for a Russian fighter. Then he comes back, last year, gets kind of steamrolled by Duraev, and then it's a whole other almost full year. All of a sudden, one of the more promising signings of 2019 is now 31 on a 2-fight losing streak where he's not been terribly competitive in either fight. This is a winnable fight for him. Like, even dilapidated, I think he's a better fighter than DeCirico, unless the time off has cost him, unless the injuries, unless, the bout with COVID has like had long-standing effects on him. I think he's better than DeCirico everywhere, but in just like sheer physical horsepower. Like I'm sure DeCirico can like bench and squat more than him, but he should be faster, have more power on the feet. I think he's a much better wrestler. I am kind of going out on a limb here and saying I think Kopylov is probably a better fighter than he's looked in his last couple fights. He's still only 31. So this is all me guessing that he's not completely dilapidated. And if he's not, I think he handles DeKirico. I know why he's the slight underdog here, but I think he's a better fighter than DeKirico. DeKirico's tough. He's not been finished many times. And despite how kind of big and powerful he is, he has a good gas tank. He's not, really been drowned late in fights. So give me Kopylov to win a decision, but I think this fight happens where Kopylov wants it. I think it stays on the feet for as long as he wants, where he kind of touches up DeKirico. If he wants it to go to the ground, I think he can get it there. If DeKirico tries to take it to the ground, I don't think he's going to have much luck getting takedowns against Kopylov. So give me Kopylov by a clear-cut decision. And if we got a late finish, it wouldn't surprise me too much.
Yeah, I'm with you in the aspect that I think we kind of at this point know what Alessio Di Chirico is, versus there's a lot more unknown with Roman Kopylov, right? And this one, it's a matchup of guys who have had some pretty underwhelming UFC careers so far, which makes it one of the more tougher fights to predict on this card. And I really hope that it does not stay as high up on the card as it is right now. I mean, these guys have lost combined 6 to 7 fights, so I really don't see any reason for them to be the fight that feeds us into Robert Whittaker and Marvin Vettori. For Alessio Di Chirico, he got a pretty brutal head kick knockout loss in his last fight, so I'm interested to see how he's going to recover from that. He's shown to be reckless on the feet, definitely gets hit a little bit for my liking. He did have that tough head kick knockout loss to Abdul Razak Al Hassan in the first round of his last fight. So he's definitely cold right now. He's lost 4 of 5. And I don't like to use the term boring fighter, but he can be definitely slower in a lot of his fights.
Let us only ever speak truth on this show, Noah. Yeah. If it's boring, just say it's boring.
He can be a little boring sometimes. If you look at the Patrick Cummins fight, the ref yelled at him like it felt like 6 different times during that fight. It was just a slow fight. A lot of his fights are definitely slower. And then on the other side, you got Kopylov, who's a heavy-handed dude, 7 knockout victories to his record. I might be an outlier on this, but I'm actually not that concerned about his 0-2 start to his UFC career. He's had some tough matchups for a guy to come right into the UFC with Karl Roberson and Jurayev. I believe in his potential. 0-2, we've seen guys start their careers 0-2. Guy that stands out to me, Merab. He lost his first 2 fights at the UFC. Been on a tear ever since. So I think we could see a similar trajectory from Roman Kopylov. I don't think he has a lot of the physical attributes and the talent that Merab has, but nonetheless, I think it's a guy that we could see really. I wouldn't be surprised if he rattled off a pretty nice win streak from here on out. He likes to load up on his shots and wing punches, so I think this one's going to take place on the feet a lot of the fight. Both guys looking to stand here. It might be a little slower paced, all the more reason for it not to be as high up on the card as it is. Each guy really likes to pick their shots, but at the end of the day, we got a guy in Di Chirico who eats a few too many shots for my liking against a heavy-handed Kopylov who's going to be hungry after losing his first 2 fights in the UFC. So give me Kopylov by, I think gets him out of there in the second round. I think he will.
All right. We have our first unanimous upset pick of the evening in the closest fight of the evening on the books. The co-main event of UFC Paris is a middleweight contenders match, but we'll get to that in a minute. A high-level middleweight matchup between Robert Whittaker and Marvin Vettori. Whittaker, the 31-year-old New Zealand-born Australian, is 23-6 overall. He is 14-4 since joining the UFC as the winner of the Tough Smashes, Australia versus UK season. 14-4 in the UFC. Worth noting that he's 11-2 since moving up from welterweight to middleweight, with those 2 losses both coming at the hands of your middleweight champ, Israel Adesanya. His last fight was lost to Adesanya in their rematch at UFC 271 back in February. He'll try to get things back on track against Vettori. The 28-year-old from Northern Italy is 18-5-1 overall. He is 7-3-1 in the UFC. He lost to Adesanya back at UFC 263 last June via unanimous decision. Came back last October and faced Paulo Costa in a fight that started at middleweight, briefly moved to a 195-pound catch weight, and then moved up to red wine weight, aka 205, by fight night. Despite Costa kind of holding that fight night main event hostage, Vettori did come out on the good side of a unanimous decision. He's going to try to make it 2 straight against Whitaker. He is not favored to do so. Whitaker is minus 230 right now. Vettori around plus 190 as the underdog. Again, depending on whose rankings you look at, I believe in the UFC's own rankings, these guys are the number 1 and number 2 contenders in the division. In Sherdog's rankings, I'm sure they're both in the top 4 of the middleweight rankings. For as high ranked as these guys are, this fight has the potential to be almost meaningless in terms of divisional relevance. I'm reminded of, well, at welterweight last weekend when Leon Edwards shocked the world and knocked out Kamaru Usman. The 2 happiest people on the planet, other than Leon Edwards and his mom, would be Colby Covington and Jorge Masvidal. Because now, if they make the grudge match between those 2, it goes from a meaningless grudge match between 2 guys that are both 0-2 against Kamaru Usman to all of a sudden, whoever wins that one has a good case at fighting your new champ, Leon Edwards. I think the same vibe is here. Like, this is a cool fight, but as long as Israel Adesanya is your champ, you know, it is a stay busy fight for both guys. And it's a fight I think that the UFC has put together so that these guys don't knock off any of your Nassourdine Imavovs that they're desperately hoping will start climbing the ranks. You know, let me throw this to you for your pick first, but tell me first, is there anything either of these guys could do to make you excited for a third fight with Israel Adesanya, or are both these guys stuck as long as Adesanya is your champ? Like, take that and then tell me how you think this fight goes.
I think the only thing that could happen that would lead me to be excited for a third fight between either of these guys with Israel Adesanya, it's a few things have to play out. I think Israel Adesanya has to have a tough fight against Alex Pereira. He has to beat him. And then one of these guys, the winner of this fight, has to look great against Alex Pereira and look better against him than Adesanya did. Then, and probably only then, will I be excited for a third fight between either of these guys and Israel Adesanya. And it also wouldn't hurt if they came out and looked great in their fight in Paris. But, I mean, combined, like you said, I combined 3 title fight losses to Adesanya, 0-4 total against him. If Robert Whitaker just wins this fight, Adesanya makes easy work out of Alex Pereira, am I going to be excited for a third fight between them? No, I'm not. But if he comes out, looks great here, looks great against Pereira, who makes Izzy work, and we could tell ourselves, like, hey, Robert Whitaker handled that guy better than Israel Adesanya did, now you might have me for a third fight. But anything short of that, and I know it's a lot that needs to play out, but really anything short of that, I don't think there's a ton of intrigue in that fight. The division's just in a really, really weird spot right now. If Izzy wins the fight in November and looks great doing it, you know, he's taken a lot of criticism for maybe being a little bit of a boring fighter himself. So if he just comes out and lights up Alex Pereira, I mean, good for him. But also, there's so many guys in the division now, like Whitaker and Vettori, who are just going to be in complete no man's land. So I guess if you lose this fight for either of these guys, do you just consider changing weight classes? Because you're so far from the title shot now. I mean, even if you win this fight, you might be far from a title shot. So if you lose this fight, I think it could be a smart move. You know, at the 185-pound division, it's probably the worst division you could be in. If you're looking to jump around weight classes, you got to go 15 pounds down if you want to go down, and up 20. And as we saw when Israel tried to do that, it's a really tough jump. So that's obviously easier said than done. But if I lose this fight, I really, especially if I'm Robert Whitaker and I lose this fight after already having 2 shots at the belt against Adesanya, I think I'm really taking a look in the mirror and seeing, can I thrive at 185, or from Whitaker, or excuse me, at 205, and from Whitaker, I'm saying, is there something for me at 170? I know he's talking about how he just really didn't feel that great there, and he's had some weight cutting related issues in the past, so he'd probably have to go up if we're being honest. But I think if you lose this fight, that's really something you have to consider if you're one of these guys. Now, to get into Whittaker, he's obviously one of the best boxers we've ever seen at 185. We did see some more grappling out of him in his last Adesanya fight. I don't know if that's because he all of a sudden has a newfound prowess in grappling or he just didn't want to stand with Izzy. But nonetheless, we did see it out of him. I don't think he'll try with Vettori just because I don't think he'll have to. He only did it because he had to with Israel. And I really think he's going to be the better striker on the feet with Marvin Vettori. When it comes to Vettori, I think he is what he is. He's a very solid top 5 fighter. I don't think he's ever going to be a guy who's in that Covington/Whittaker role where you're just a consistent second best guy. I think he's definitely a more beatable fighter for some of the other prospects in the division than Whittaker is. Good boxer, thrives in the pocket, but I just think he's kind of a Walmart version of Robert Whittaker, if we're being honest. I don't think he's as powerful. I don't think he's as slick, clean. I don't think he's as creative. I think if it is a 3-round fight, which is going for him, if he's able to maybe steal some rounds, just grinding Whittaker up against the fence. He tried to do that with Adesanya. He wasn't able to do it. So maybe, he steals a round or two, just holding Whittaker up against the fence. But Yoel Romero couldn't hold Robert Whittaker down. So I just find it hard to believe that Vettori is going to be able to do that. And now, like you said, he's just a solid top 5 guy. And when you look back at his resume of the guy he's fought, it kind of makes that title shot that he got, a little flukier. He did it coming off a win against Kevin Holland, Jack Hermanson, Carl Roberson, were the 3 guys he beat to get a title shot. I mean, you go back and look, that's one of the weaker title shot resumes we've seen. And then even after that, he beats Paulo Costa, who we knew didn't really take that fight seriously. And now after watching his last fight, there's definitely a lot of questions about how high level of fighter Paulo Costa even is. So you look at it and like, what is Marvin Vettori's signature win? And it would most certainly be Robert Whittaker. And I don't think it's going to be his night. I think Whittaker is just the better fighter. He's going to win all the exchanges. He's too crisp on the feet. And I think that Vettori's talent and his resume might be a little inflated. So give me Robert Whittaker by unanimous decision here.
I like the breakdown there, and a lot of the specific things you pointed out about these guys. The one definite advantage that Vettori will have on Whittaker is he will be the larger man in the cage. Like Vettori, he's not that tall. He's like, 6 feet tall, maybe 6'1", but he is a burly, like thickly built guy. He's going to be bigger than Whittaker. He'll be taller. I don't know if his reach will be longer, but I suspect it might. He will probably be the heavier guy in the cage by like 10 or 12 pounds when they walk in there, but it doesn't matter. Robert Whittaker is always the smaller guy in the cage, except like the one fight against Kelvin Gastelum. But other than that, on his 11-2 run at middleweight, everyone he's fought has either been taller than him, heavier than him, or both. And it has made no difference. He is, you pointed out that he's one of the best boxers, we've ever seen in that division. And shockingly, underratedly well-rounded. He's always been a very good wrestler, like a surprisingly good offensive wrestler, even though he gives up size at this division, a nearly impregnable defensive wrestler. And his offensive wrestling, he kind of wrestles like an American. Like he'll shoot a double leg, he'll shoot a single leg. His entries are fast. You always worry that that's going to leave him as he's, a very old 31, a guy that's, had knee injuries, and, the wrong kind of those will kill your explosion. You'll never be the same fighter again. It's why we're all like just kind of waiting and hoping and praying to the deity of our choice that Tom Aspinall is the same fighter he was before UFC London when he comes back. So you always worry that a guy like Whittaker, even though he's only 31, shockingly younger than Adesanya, will go off a cliff physically, but he's shown no signs of that. He looked great against Adesanya. He's different from Vettori in that their second fight was closer. A few fringe weirdos actually scored that fight for Whittaker. I wasn't one of them, but I definitely gave Whittaker 2 rounds, whereas Adesanya schooled him in their first fight. Whittaker had made intelligent adjustments, and I think he fought the best fight Robert Whittaker possibly could against Adesanya. I'm not excited to see a third matchup between them, only because I don't see what else he could possibly do to make it any closer. Like, his high water mark was taking a couple rounds off Israel Adesanya and really kind of taking him out of his game. He's so smart. Even after he was the champ, he's continued to add new wrinkles to his game. Like, he lost the title against Adesanya. It was a crushing loss, obviously. He came back against Darren Till and just had a bunch of smart little wrinkles that were designed to take advantage of things he clearly had seen in Till's game. Like, just little elbow strikes on the inside against a guy in Till that had just, was hulked over him and had much longer reach. Jared Cannonier, a guy with some of the best one-shot power in the division, just, he completely neutralized it. Like, Cannonier really struggled to land cleanly on Whittaker. It's like one of the reasons that the Cannonier versus Adesanya matchup wasn't more exciting, because we were like, well, if he's having trouble finding Robert Whittaker's chin, like, what's he going to do to Adesanya? Just a super smart fighter. And because of that, I don't see what Vettori's going to have to really threaten him. Vettori hits hard, but he's just not nearly as sophisticated a striker as Whittaker, and Whittaker's had plenty of time to study his game. If Darren Till struggled to hit Whittaker cleanly, if guys with power like Yoel Romero and Jared Cannonier and Kelvin Gastelum couldn't land hard on Whittaker consistently enough to put him away, I don't see how Vettori can. Vettori is another guy that's a surprisingly good wrestler. For, again, a guy from, Italy that doesn't really have any amateur wrestling background. He's taken well to it. Kudos to Vettori for moving his training to the U.S. early in his career. It's done good things for him. He's a good wrestler, but he's got nothing that Robert Whittaker hasn't seen before. So, yeah, I think this just kind of plays into Whittaker's hands. And if Vettori sits back, I think he's just going to kind of lose a comfortable 3-round decision. If he pushes the issue, I think Whittaker starts lighting him up, maybe shoots a surprise, reactive double and takes him down and mashes him on the ground, and we get a rout. I'm not picking that. I'm picking Vettori to be kind of contained and strategic about this, but I think Robert Whittaker kind of makes it look easy against Marvin Vettori. And I think your assessment was right, that Robert Whittaker is where he is because he is the number 2 guy in this division, whereas we may have already seen Vittori's high water mark, even though he's the younger guy. And from here, he may stick around as a top 10 fixture for a while. But, losing this fight on Saturday is probably as close as he gets to another 185-pound title shot. Give me Whittaker by a decision in which he sweeps all 3 rounds, and there's not really much question.
Yeah, I think the same thing happens.
That brings us to the main event of UFC Fight Night 209, a heavyweight headliner between former interim champ Ciryl Gane and the surging Tai Tuivasa. Gane, the 32-year-old Frenchman, is 10-1 overall. He is 7-1 since joining the UFC as a 3-0 prospect out of TKO. He won his first 7 fights in the UFC in a row, including an interim title fight knockout of Derek Lewis at UFC 265 last August. That got him to a title unification fight this January against Francis Ngannou at UFC 270, where he lost a pretty lopsided decision as Ngannou decided to embrace his inner wrestler, showed us D1 Ngannou for the first time, unveiled his new death ray to great effect. He will try to get things back on track against Tuivasa. The 29-year-old Australian is 14-3 overall. He is 8-3 in the UFC. He's on a 5-fight win streak, all of them by knockout, all of them within the first 2 rounds. The last 3 of them have netted him $50,000 performance bonuses from the UFC. They are Stefan Struve, Harry Hunsucker, Greg Hardy, Augusto Sakai, and, as previously mentioned, Lewis, whom he knocked out with a completely vicious standing elbow at UFC 271 back in February. The odds here, widest ones on the card, notwithstanding all the late notice matchups we have. Gane is -600, Tuivasa +400 on the comeback. I'll go first here. The odds they're a reflection not of what the odds makers think. They're a referendum on what bettors think, because all the odds makers are trying to do is set a line that will bring in action on both sides. Like that, that's their whole job. That's how they make their money. But that means that the bulk of people out there think that Gane is the real deal, whereas Tuivasa's win streak, however impressive, hasn't answered all the questions about him as a potential title contender. That's the best way I can possibly see it. Gane's fight against Ngannou was really strange. I think I don't think that turned out the way anybody thought it would. I think most people thought going into that fight that either Ngannou was going to find Gane's chin and just starch him with, maybe the hardest one punch power in MMA history, or Gane was going to use his frankly more sophisticated kickboxing game to. The term I kept using during his win streak coming up was snake charm. Because, he thrashed the Don'Tale Mays and Tanner Bozers of the world just because he was a 10 times better fighter. But once he got into the realm of fighting other contenders, like Jairzinho Rozenstruik, he turned Jairzinho Rozenstruik from a guy who fought like his hair was on fire and his car was double parked into a guy that just stood and stared literally for 5 minutes and threw 3 strikes around. Alexander Volkov, who Alexander Volkov is as well-rounded and skilled a fighter as there is in that division, and a walking matchup problem for just about everyone he fights. And he managed to take Volkov completely out of his game. Volkov just stood there hypnotized as a shorter guy just pelted him with leg kicks, again, for 5 full rounds. I watched him fight Derek Lewis in Houston, and I picked Lewis, but that's because I'm a shameless homer. But what I did pick correctly was I said, Lewis isn't going to stand there and be snake charmed. Whatever happens in this fight, we're going to get a fight. Like, Lewis is going to come forward and he's going to throw his head kicks, and he's going to throw his flying knee to close the distance, and he's going to look for the chance to land his big right hand. That's what Derek Lewis is going to do. It's what Derek Lewis did. And he got trucked. Gane was just way too good for him. Then he runs into Ngannou, and basically we don't see the finesse versus power kickboxing matchup. Ngannou takes him down with ease in at least 3 of 5 rounds, wins going away. I've got to think that Gane is still at least the guy that beat Rozenstruik, Volkov, and Lewis. I certainly don't expect that Tuivasa is going to. I don't think Tuivasa watched the Ngannou fight and said, that is a path to victory that I can replicate with my skill set and my aptitude. I just got to work on my wrestling. That's not in Tuivasa. Tuivasa wants to knock your block off and drink some beer out of a sweaty old shoe. That is what Tai Tuivasa does. Tuivasa beat Lewis. He knocked him out again in Houston. Breaks my heart. And I'm not saying it's a fluke. He threw the strike he meant to, it landed, and it cold cocked Lewis, who is, traditionally one of the best chins in the division. But you can make the argument that Lewis at 36, 37 is starting to decline, like all the wars have caught up with him. You can make the argument that Lewis did not completely fight to his best advantage because he wanted to get another big win in front of his hometown. Like, if Lewis and Tuivasa fight 10 times, I don't know what it looks. I don't know if Tuivasa wins 7 of them, if Lewis wins 7 of them, if they're all knockouts, but I know it doesn't look like that every single time. Like, if Lewis and Gane fight 10 times, I think it looks like that like 9 out of 10 times. The things that Tuivasa has shown, the improvements he's shown, he hasn't shown me anything that thinks his chances are going to be any better against Gane than I would have thought a year or 2 ago. And we're talking about someone in Tuivasa who's made enormous improvements. Like, Tuivasa won his first 3 fights in the UFC, destroyed Rashad Coulter, former middleweight Rashad Coulter, make of that what you will. He destroyed Cyril Asker. Again, Cyril Asker, just not a high-level heavyweight. He won a decision over the ghost of Andrei Arlovsky, who, it's a very legit win, but the 2018 version of Arlovsky really, really, really didn't want to taste Tuivasa's power at all. So he just kind of let himself lose a decision. Then Tuivasa lost 3 fights in a row once he kind of graduated to that level of contenders. He lost to Junior Dos Santos, lost to Blago Ivanov, lost to Sergey Spivak. Kind of your 10 through 15 guys where he had a chance to prove he was a contender. He lost all 3. He didn't look particularly good in any of them. And I remember being on a recap show after or no, I remember being on a preview show for the Spivak fight. So we'd lost to Dos Santos and Ivanov. He was about to fight Spivak. We all favored Spivak. And one of the people on the panel, and it was Blaine Henry from the Fight Library, he asked, do you think Tai Tuivasa trains? Just full stop. It wasn't, do you think he trains jiu-jitsu? Or do you think he trains, with Thai pads? Just, do you think he trains flat, full stop? Because he just still looked like a really tough ex-Australian footballer fighting in a parking lot at kind of a higher level. There's no question now. Like, nobody's asking, does Tai Tuivasa train? Like, he is transformed as a fighter. Physically, he looks better. I mean, he's always going to have that kind of Mark Hunt body where, like the athleticism and the muscle are just kind of hiding under a layer of jiggle. But he's looked leaner. His cardio has been better. He's been sharper. Just his punches are straighter, which has allowed his surprisingly good natural hand speed to stick out. He throws more kicks than before, which is a sign of a guy with better confidence in his takedown defense, with better confidence in his gas tank. But he's only become just a better and better version of the fighter he was in 2017. Like, he is now kind of evolved to his like final Pokemon form of whatever he was in 2017. I don't think there is any version of that fighter that has much for Ciryl Gane. I think Tuivasa coming into this is going to have kind of the same choice that all of Gane's victims have. Either stand there and be snake charmed and lose a decision where people are just kind of like booing and wooing and hopefully not throwing things. Hopefully the French are a little more civilized than that. But lose an ugly fight like Volkov and Rosenstrike did, or go out on your shield like Derek Lewis and just, walk into leg kicks that have you hobbling, bite on feints really badly and just overswing, swing at air and get pieced up, with what Gane is throwing back at you and get knocked out inside of 3 rounds. I don't know which Tuivasa does, but I'm kind of suspecting it's the latter, and it's going to look more like the Gane versus Lewis fight. I think Tuivasa on some level knows that Saturday is his best chance ever to get a shot at the undisputed UFC title. The UFC is furious at Ngannou right now. I'm kind of surprised they didn't make this another interim title fight. Ngannou's been on the shelf. He foiled their plans because he was in Africa and couldn't defend on the schedule they wanted him to, which is why Gane versus Lewis was an interim title fight in the first place. Since then, he's been spouting off about, the money he's lost through endorsements, about the UFC's pay structure, all the things that the UFC really, really hates. That's a perfect time for a heavyweight to be on a 5-fight winning streak of all knockouts. And he has to know on some level that if he beats Gane, he is absolutely getting a title shot in his next fight. So I think he's going to go for it. If nothing else, like, this guy has gone out and dared to be great with a smile. I just don't think it's going to work out for him. I think Tuivasa swings. I think he swings at air a lot. I think Gane's leg kicks are going to bother him. I think Gane's mix of jabs and feints are really going to confuse him. And I think Tuivasa just gets busted up. Give me Gane by second round TKO, and the UFC is going to have another problem, because they will have the option to remake a not very competitive title fight between Gane and Ngannou, or do something else.
Yeah, I think I definitely like the comparison to the Gane versus Lewis fight. I think for, I really, from as long as Ciryl Gane has fought and as long as he will fight, the narrative going into each and every one of his fights is going to be the same. It's always Gane's the better mover. Gane has the better striking. Gane is a slicker kickboxer. Some of the most unique movement we've ever seen. But if person X, who has this crazy power for the heavyweight division, catches him, he's going to be in trouble. And even in his fights with Ngannou, we've yet to see anyone do that. We have not seen him caught. He lost that fight. But he didn't lose it because his movement wasn't good enough to avoid a guy that's going to blitz him like Ngannou. So I think it's going to be a lot of the same here. The stakes, I think, are interesting in this one from a lot of different angles. Obviously, the UFC goes to Paris for the first time. Who do they choose to headline it? Cyril Gane. That shows a lot of faith in this guy. I think it's an interesting tip of the cap, given that current rocky relationship that you mentioned, Francis and Ngannou. They're going to really get to see what kind of star they have in this guy. You know, how rocking will this place be for Cyril Gane? What kind of market do they have in France? What kind of numbers is this fight going to do, headlined by the Frenchman in France? Is this a market they are going to want to build around? And then for Tuivasa, they're certainly not mad if he does pull it off either. He's going to be, you know, shooing after a almost 4-1 upset on his way to a title shot. That stuff is going to be all over the place. He's going to be a huge star. I'd argue his star potential is bigger than Cyril Gane. Cyril Gane in France, yes, he'll be the hometown guy, but I think globally, I don't think it's a question that Tai Tuivasa would be a bigger star, and a fight with him and Francis would definitely outsell a rematch with Francis and Cyril Gane. That being said, I don't think that Cyril Gane is in the same position that a guy like Robert Whittaker's in. I think that if he fought Francis Ngannou again, that fight sells, and I think there's still a lot of interest surrounding that fight, given how the first fight went, where we see this ferocious, ungodly puncher Francis Ngannou resort to double leg takedowns against Cyril Gane. So I think that fight, running it back, has a lot of potential still. So it's not like if Cyril Gane wins, it's like, oh man, what do we do? I think we could run that fight back, and it's definitely one I would still want to see. Gane, he had that hole in his game exposed by Francis. I think it's something he'll be able to work on, and it could potentially come into play in this fight, but it would take a lot of stones from Tuivasa just to be like, well, Francis did it, guess I can too. I don't think that's how he's wired. I think he's going to be looking for that shot the whole fight. I think he's going to have to try to close the distance and hit him with a shot in close, kind of like he did with Derek Lewis. And Tuivasa, he does have that insane power, but I would argue that he knows how to use his power and set up his shots more than Francis did at this point in his career. Francis now, I think, has a better ability. You see he hit Stipe Miocic with a beautiful setup to capture that heavyweight title. But when Francis was coming up, kind of like where Tai is right now, even leading up to that first Stipe fight, he was just throwing wild. He knew he had that crazy power, and he would just almost run at guys and swing like crazy until he connected. I don't think that's who Tai Tuivasa is. I think he sets up a lot of his shots. That elbow he hit Derek Lewis with was beautifully framed, beautifully set up. But that doesn't change the fact that right now there's a lot of questions surrounding this guy going into this fight. We've never seen him go 5 rounds. Like you said, he's got a ton of body fat on him. He shoeies all the time. Who knows what he's going to look like in the 4th, 5th rounds of this fight. We've never seen him do it. And we've never really seen him use his ground game. And by all indications, that's probably your only chance to beat Cyril Gane. If we've looked at Derek Lewis and Derek Lewis and Francis Ngannou step in there with this guy, and neither of them being able to land that big shot, that's got to be very discouraging if you're Tai Tuivasa, because you got to be looking in the mirror saying, what did those guys do what did those guys not do that I will be able to do? And I really don't know the answer to that question. I think his game is so similar to theirs, and the fact that they couldn't do it, it does not leave you a lot of faith for the fact that he's going to be able to crack him. That being said, I am rooting for Tai Tuivasa. I want to believe that he's going to land that one big shot. I'd say he's going to blow the roof off the place, but in reality, it would probably just go silent if he did it. I wonder if he did it. What's that?
Let me interject a little bit of personal perspective here. I saw, again, Tai Tuivasa fight Derek Lewis in Houston. Derek Lewis in Houston is as popular as any fighter anywhere in the world. Like, when they're in the Toyota Center and he's fighting, it's louder than it is for the Rockets. It's louder than it is for any concert I've been to in that venue. It is bananas. They did not like Tai Tuivasa before that fight. They liked Tai Tuivasa after that fight. Like, he was getting handed, shoeies on his way out. He won over the crowd, frankly, in a way that Gane didn't. And Gane tried to. Gane, walked in to, Houston hip hop, trying to play to the crowd a little bit. He walked into some Mike Jones. They weren't buying it. They booed the shit out of him. They didn't especially love him after the fight. Tai Tuivasa won over that crowd effortlessly. And it's an indication of his potential incipient star power. He got Dana White to do a shoey at the post-fight presser. Like he introduced his like line of shoe-shaped flasks. He was handing them out all week, but he put Dana on the spot to take a shoey, and Dana did. That's kind of the equivalent of Dana wearing a Korean Zombie t-shirt when Korean Zombie was like 2-0 in the UFC. Like if he is personally getting behind a fighter that's not a champ yet, that's a sign that he sees stars. Like that puts you in the kind of Conor McGregor, next Conor McGregor type mold, at least in his mind. So I agree with you that Tuivasa's star potential is way bigger than Gane's, and we may be surprised at how it goes in France if he does win. But please go ahead.
I think, like you said, if you're Dana White in the UFC brass and you see in France, in your first ever show in France, they're still handing Tai Tuivasa shoes to chug beer out of.
Will they be full of red wine though?
Yeah, I don't know what they serve in that arena in France. They don't seem like the beer chugging people over there, but nonetheless, if you see that happening, I think then for sure. Like if you don't already, which they seem to know, but you definitely have something in this Tai Tuivasa. I think if he fought Francis Ngannou on pay-per-view for the title after knocking out Cyril Gane, that is an all-time heavyweight title fight pay-per-view. I mean, that's up there just in terms of, maybe not in terms of skill level, but in terms of excitement and hype and build-up and traction. I think that would be as far up there as it gets. But unfortunately,
the biggest since Brock Lesnar was UFC champ. It would have a bigger fight feel than anything since Brock Lesnar was the champ. Yeah,
100% agree. And again, I don't think it would be as high level talent matchup as say when Stipe fought Verdum, but in terms of the big fight feel, oh yeah, it would be there. That lead up would be unbelievable. So for that reason, I'm rooting for Tai. I want to see that more than anything else in this division. But you just look at all the evidence, you say Derek Lewis couldn't hurt. Not only are these guys not knocking him out, they're not even hurting him. They're not coming close. I remember in that Derek Lewis fight, all he had was he'd do the thing where he pretends to be hurt, and then Cyril Gane will come at him, and then he'd wing a huge right hand, and then you're watching and going, oh, well, maybe he'll catch him with one of those. But it was never going to happen. Even with Francis, I would argue that Cyril Gane was outstriking Francis on the feet, and that's why he had to resort to those takedowns. So if those guys couldn't do it, I just really struggle to see Tai Tuivasa being able to do it. I'm not as bullish with you on Cyril Gane being able to get it done early. I think Tai's just too dangerous for Gane to get that aggressive so early in the fight. But I think given the questions we'll have about Tuivasa going 25 minutes in a fight and the fact that Gane really it will become more and more apparent as the fight goes on that Tuivasa just is not going to land that big shot. Gane's confidence is going to gain. He's going to start putting the pressure on him. And then I think around the fourth round, Cyril Gane's going to get the finish. TKO in the fourth round.
There you go. 2 picks for Cyril Gane to make the French fans ecstatic by knockout in the headliner of UFC Fight Night 209. That's it. 12 fights down. This has been the Sherdog Radio Network preview for UFC Fight Night Gane versus Tuivasa, also known as UFC Paris. I have been Ben Duffy. He is Noah Gagnon. If this is your first time watching one of our previews, first of all, thank you. We hope you enjoyed it. Noah has stepped in capably for my usual co-host, Keith Schillen. Please do like, subscribe, do all those things. Most of all, comment, because Keith and I are both very good about responding to those comments. Just, let us know if you think we got anything way wrong. Put yourself out there, go on record. But more importantly, join us for the recap. We are live on the Sherdog YouTube page, usually about 15 minutes after the main event, where I believe Keith will be back by then. So it'll be Keith and I live breaking down all these fights in reverse order of how we just did it. We will start with the main event, work all the way down to the first fight on the card, talk about what was good, what was bad, what was surprising, what was controversial. There's always something. And the live chat on our YouTube page is wide open during that time. So we are taking your questions, your comments, your hot takes, and your one-liners in real time. We have a growing community there, and we'd love you to join. It's both Keith and I, both of our probably favorite thing we do as part of the Sherdog Radio Network. We will definitely get Noah on one of these times, because I think you'd have fun as well, assuming it is not past your bedtime, because you're very young. That was like a young person joke. But that's it. Between now and then, thank you again for watching. Enjoy the rest of your week, and by all means, enjoy the fights.